Zoe Hastings was born on November 21, 1996, in Kansas and was the first child in the family, which later grew to include 4 more children. Her 3 younger sisters and brother could always count on the care and support of their older sister. From a young age, Zoe showed responsibility and a willingness to help her parents with raising the younger siblings. She was the type of person who always put family first and readily postponed her own plans if her mom or dad needed her assistance. Zoe's parents were deeply religious and actively involved their children in church life. Faith occupied a central place in their home, and family trips to church were an integral part of their lives. Zoe grew up in an atmosphere of spirituality and love, which shaped her kindness, compassion, and strong sense of responsibility for her loved ones. Zoe attended the local school in Dallas, Texas, where her family had moved when she was still a child. At school, Zoe proved to be a diligent and determined student who actively participated in school community life. She not only excelled academically but also took part in volunteer projects organized by the church and school. Zoe was known for her kindness and desire to help others, which made her popular among classmates and teachers. After graduating from high school, Zoe planned to attend college. She was drawn to the humanities and dreamed of dedicating her life to helping others, possibly in social work or education. While preparing for college, Zoe worked to contribute to the family budget and save for her future studies. She found a job at a local store, where her hard work and responsibility quickly earned her the respect of colleagues and management. She was known for her attention to detail and friendly demeanor with customers. In addition, Zoe continued to be actively involved in church life, assisting in organizing events and volunteer activities. Despite her youth, Zoe had already proven herself to be a mature, responsible, and compassionate person, ready not only to care for her loved ones but also to contribute to society. Her life, filled with future plans, was tragically cut short, leaving a deep pain and a bright memory of her in the hearts of all who knew her. On Sunday, October 11, 2015, Zoe Hastings' day began like any other Sunday morning in her family. She spent time with her family, preparing for the day's events. In the morning, she helped her parents with her younger siblings, as Sundays were always an important day for them, associated with church attendance and family activities. At around 4:30 p.m., she left home in their family Honda Odyssey minivan. Her parents knew she was heading to church and were not worried when she left her. First, Zoe stopped at a video rental store near their home to pick out a movie. After that, she headed to church for the evening service. Unfortunately, she never arrived at church. When Zoe did not return home at the expected time, her parents began to worry. In the evening, around 7 p.m., they started calling her friends and acquaintances to find out where she might be, but no one knew where Zoe was. By nightfall, the parents' anxiety increased, and they contacted the police to report their daughter missing. Concerned about her absence, Zoe's parents called 911. However, to their surprise, officers did not come to their home to take the missing person report. Realizing that every minute counted, they decided to take matters into their own hands. They went to the police station, filed a missing person report, and then began their own search. Despite their exhaustion, they drove the entire route from home to the church multiple times, along the route Zoe should have taken. They carefully examined every nearby street, hoping to find any trace, but their search yielded no results. The night passed in agonizing anticipation, and as dawn approached, Zoe's mother had an idea. She remembered that her daughter's phone had a location tracking app, and they had access to her geolocation. Hope returned. They immediately checked Zoe's phone location and found that her device was just a few hundred meters from the church, near a creek across the road. With anxiety and fear, her parents rushed to the spot. But when they arrived, their hearts sank in horror. Numerous police cars, an ambulance, and rescue personnel were already at the scene. Their worst fears began to come true as they realized something terrible involving their daughter had happened at that location. When Zoe's parents approached one of the officers, they informed him that they were searching for their daughter. The officer explained that there had been a car accident at the location. The police had received a report from a witness who was walking his dog nearby. According to him, a man approached him and said that an accident had occurred near the creek and the girl had been seriously injured. The witness and the man immediately went to the scene. When they arrived, the witness saw the girl lying in a pool of blood and immediately called the police. The officers who arrived at the scene quickly identified her. She was Zoe Hastings. However, after inspecting the scene and the body, they realized that her death was not the result of an accident. The circumstances indicated a much darker outcome. Zoe had become a victim of a brutal murder. This information instantly turned the search for the girl into a murder investigation, and Zoe's parents were faced with a terrifying reality. Zoe lay on the ground just a few meters from the minivan, which was partially submerged in the creek. The police immediately noticed deep cuts on her neck. The sight of such horrific violence even shocked the experienced officers. When Zoe's parents tried to approach their daughter, they were stopped and warned that it would be better for them not to see the gruesome scene. The police also observed that Zoe's dress was pulled up and her underwear was lowered. This fact raised serious concerns that the girl might have been sexually assaulted before her murder. Nearby the body, under a bridge embankment, a knife covered in blood was found. This weapon had apparently been used to inflict fatal wounds. The knife became a key piece of evidence that could link the perpetrator to this brutal murder. Footprints leading from the minivan to the location where the body was found also caught the investigators' attention. These tracks could belong to either the victim or her killer, and their analysis became an important part of the forensic work. Zoe's smartphone, found in her bag, played a crucial role in reconstructing the timeline of that tragic evening. Analysis of the geolocation data showed that Zoe arrived in the area of the creek at 5:01 p.m., meaning she was there only 20 minutes after leaving home. This data allowed investigators to pinpoint the timeline of her movements, highlighting how quickly events had turned tragic. All these pieces of evidence, the knife, the footprints, the state of the body, and the phone data, helped investigators begin to piece together what had happened. They understood that they were facing a complex task requiring precision and attention to every detail. Each piece of evidence could be a key to solving this tragedy, and the investigators were determined to see the case through to the end and find the culprit. According to investigators, Zoe was murdered literally minutes after she arrived at the creek. The police were able to establish that after leaving home, Zoe made one short stop. She stopped at a store where there was a DVD rental service to return a rented movie. This place became the last point on her path to the fateful moment. While experts meticulously examined Zoe's body and collected evidence at the crime scene, detectives focused on finding potential witnesses. They decided to question everyone who might have been in or around the store at the time Zoe was there. It was important to determine if anyone had noticed strange behavior or suspicious individuals following her. Every small detail or memory could be key to unraveling what happened after Zoe left the store. After interviewing dozens of people, investigators finally found two potential witnesses who might shed light on what occurred. One of them was Lester Clark, an employee at a tattoo parlor located next to the store where Zoe made her final stop. Clark, who had spent the entire day at work, was one of the few who could observe what was happening around the store. Since his workspace was directly across from the store entrance, he could see Zoe enter and exit. He recalled seeing her that day when she came to the store to return a DVD. According to him, Zoe appeared calm and showed no signs of distress. She went into the store, returned the movie, and headed back to her car. However, Lester noted something peculiar. As Zoe was leaving the store, a man approached her who did not seem familiar at first glance. Lester described the man as a dark-skinned individual of short stature with a solid build, dark hair, and shabby clothing. Because Lester was observing from a considerable distance in the parking lot, he couldn't make out specific facial features. They exchanged a few words, and although the conversation appeared casual, Lester thought Zoe seemed slightly tense. He saw the man follow her to the minivan. Clark didn't think much of it at the time, but now, in light of what had happened, he recalled details that had previously seemed insignificant. According to him, the man seemed to be trying to attract Zoe's attention, and she didn't appear thrilled about the interaction. Lester noticed that when she approached the vehicle, she unexpectedly moved to the passenger seat, and the man, who had been with her, took the driver's seat. They then left together, which struck Lester as somewhat odd. Gary Whitman, a homeless man who was the second witness, provided similar information, adding new details to the investigation. He was nearby the store on the day Zoe made her final stop. Whitman said he noticed the girl when she left the store and headed toward her minivan. What drew Gary's attention was that a man was standing near her car, seemingly waiting for her return. Gary Whitman gave a similar description of the suspect, describing him as dark-skinned, of average height, and with a solid build. He appeared somewhat tense, as if he was concerned or focused on something. Gary noted that Zoe seemed a bit uneasy when she approached the man, but did not show overt signs of worry. The man then took something out of his pocket and showed it to her. After that, she appeared reluctant but eventually got into the car, moving to the passenger seat while the man took the driver's seat, and they drove away. Later, when the police questioned him, he remembered another detail. When he was leaving the store, he saw the man again, this time walking toward the store. This alarmed him enough to go back into the store and ask the clerk to call 911. However, it was unclear whether the clerk followed through with his request, as the police found no record of such a call. As investigators continued to question witnesses, forensic experts made several significant discoveries. The coroner, examining Zoe's body, found traces of male semen. Unfortunately, the amount of biological material was too small for a complete DNA analysis. However, even this limited result confirmed the horrifying fact: Zoe had been sexually assaulted before her murder. Forensic experts thoroughly examined Zoe's vehicle but found no foreign fingerprints on the door handles or steering wheel. This was unexpected for the investigators, as witnesses indicated that the suspect might have driven away in the minivan with Zoe from the store parking lot. This turn of events caught the detectives by surprise, but they did not rule out the possibility that the perpetrator might have carefully wiped the steering wheel and door handles to conceal his fingerprints. Additionally, several hairs were found on Zoe's body that could belong to the perpetrator. Unfortunately, experts could not obtain a complete DNA sample from these hairs as they were too short and damaged. This fact complicated the investigation, depriving the investigators of another potential lead. However, when forensic experts examined the knife found near the crime scene, they made a significant breakthrough. A DNA sample was discovered on the blade, which was an important development in the investigation. This sample was immediately uploaded to the FBI's national database for comparison. Now the investigators had a real chance to identify the perpetrator and link him to the crime. The police soon received the result they had hoped for. The DNA sample matched one in the database belonging to 34-year-old Antonio Cochran. Prior to this incident, Cochran had a criminal record, including several arrests for violent crimes and sexual offenses. His name was known to the police, and he was in the criminal database, which allowed the investigators to quickly connect him to the murder based on the DNA found on the weapon. Antonio Cochran was born and raised in difficult social conditions. His childhood and adolescence were spent in a disadvantaged neighborhood where crime was an integral part of daily life. Without proper support and mentorship, Cochran was exposed to the underworld early on and quickly became a part of it. At a young age, Antonio began to get in trouble with the law. His record includes arrests for various crimes including theft, assault, and sexual assault. These incidents landed him behind bars more than once, but despite this, he was never able to get on the path of correction. His life was chaotic and unstable. He had no steady job and changed residences frequently. His social ties were weak and his relationships with others were characterized by tension and mistrust. A year earlier, in 2014, Antonio Cochran's name had already surfaced in connection with another disturbing incident. The 17-year-old daughter of his then-girlfriend accused him of rape. According to her story, Antonio offered her a ride, but instead of taking her to the right address, he took the girl to a remote, wooded area. There, after threatening to kill her if she tried to escape, he abused her. Following this statement, Cochran was immediately arrested. However, under interrogation, he stubbornly insisted that there had been consensual intimacy between the two and that the allegations were false. The case went to trial, but difficulties arose during the proceedings. Key evidence needed to prove guilt was never found. Because of the lack of conclusive evidence, the judge was forced to let Antonio go free. Cochran lived in the shadow of his past crimes, and his behavior remained aggressive and unpredictable. He was a man who could not find himself in society and continued to follow a criminal path. After police officers received a DNA match, Antonio Cochran was immediately put on the wanted list. He was soon arrested, but despite the evidence, he adamantly denied any involvement in the murder. This led detectives to focus on finding additional evidence that could confirm his guilt. The first thing the experts did was to take a DNA sample from Antonio to compare it with the materials found on the victim's body, hair and traces of semen. However, both of these pieces of evidence turned out to be too small for meaningful genetic analysis. In such a situation, the experts could only conduct another type of testing that produced an approximate profile and determined if it did not match the suspect's DNA sample. This method worked on the principle of exclusion, but unfortunately did not provide accurate and unambiguous results. The experts compared partial genetic profiles obtained from hair and traces of semen with Antonio Cochran's DNA. The results showed that their similarities could not be ruled out, which increased suspicions of his involvement in the crime. Meanwhile, detectives continued their investigation and turned their attention to Antonio's smartphone. While examining it, they came across several interesting messages that could shed light on his actions and intentions on that unfortunate day. Among them were texts sent in the days leading up to the murder that could indicate his intentions and plans. These messages were addressed to various contacts and contained hints of aggression and dislike of women. One message, sent shortly before the murder, contained a phrase that struck investigators as ominously direct: "I know how to silence her forever." This message, sent in the context of an argument or conflict, was taken as a potential admission of intent to commit violent acts. Other messages concerned his movements on the day of Zoe Hastings' disappearance. In one, he mentioned that he was going to go to the area where her body was later found, which also raised suspicion. At 1:48 a.m., even before Zoe's death, Antonio Cochran sent a text message to an acquaintance with whom he shared housing. In this message, he wrote that he was going to move out and that they would never meet again. That statement alone alerted investigators, hinting at possible plans for his sudden disappearance. Later in the afternoon, at 2:07 p.m., Antonio sent a text message to his ex-girlfriend telling her that his stepmother, whom he considered his birth mother, had passed away. He specified that the death happened in front of his eyes and he is in great emotional pain trying to cope with the loss. During the following hour, Antonio sent 2 messages to another woman, confessing that he had been drinking all night, driving around the city, and crying. These messages were the last ones he sent before Zoe's death, reflecting his unstable emotional state during that period. Later that evening, at 9:30 p.m., Antonio sent a message to a friend, admitting that he didn't know what to do and that a lot of recent events had shaken him deeply. The next day, he reached out again to his ex-girlfriend, sending a message in which he declared that his life had come to an end and that she would soon learn everything. These texts became a crucial part of the evidence, helping investigators link Antonio Cochran to the crime and strengthening the case against him. When detectives reviewed Antonio Cochran's browser history, they made another significant discovery. In the period leading up to his arrest, Antonio had visited local news sites more than 30 times, carefully browsing the sections related to crimes. Among these visits, 5 pages were directly related to news about Zoe Hastings' murder. This behavior was in stark contrast to his previous habits. Before these events, Cochran had shown little interest in news sites, and his browsing history included only 1 page related to criminal matters concerning gang activities. These changes in Cochran's behavior, His sudden interest in crime news, especially related to Zoe's murder, intensified the investigators' suspicions. Experts also uncovered another crucial lead related to the suspect's mobile phone. They requested location data from his cell phone provider and discovered that at 4:34 p.m., his phone connected to a tower covering the area where the store was located. This timing coincided with when Zoe was in the store, further raising suspicions about Antonio. However, this data could not be considered decisive evidence. The information about the cell tower connection only indicated that Antonio's phone was within a few kilometers of the store but did not provide precise location details. Nonetheless, the data suggested that Antonio was in the vicinity of the store just minutes before Zoe left the parking lot. Given that his home was a significant distance from that location, and during the day his phone connected to a tower closer to his home, this movement appeared suspicious. Detectives also learned that 3 days before the tragedy, Antonio had started a new job at a grocery store. This might have seemed like a routine event if not for one circumstance. On Monday, the day after Zoe's murder, he unexpectedly missed his shift without providing any explanation. Despite gathering extensive circumstantial evidence pointing to Antonio's involvement, the only direct and substantial piece of evidence remained the DNA sample found on the handle of the knife discovered at the crime scene. However, even this finding raised certain doubts and could pose a problem in court. The presence of the suspect's DNA on the murder weapon is not always an incontrovertible proof of guilt. Theoretically, Antonio might have handled the knife under entirely different circumstances unrelated to the murder, with the actual crime committed by someone else using the already contaminated item. Moreover, the lack of additional direct evidence, such as witness testimonies or surveillance footage, complicated the prosecution's case. Detectives thoroughly explored all possible leads in search of further confirmation of Antonio's involvement, but their efforts did not yield the desired results. All the collected materials remained circumstantial and required convincing interpretation in court. Acknowledging the risks and potential gaps in the evidence, the investigators decided to proceed with the case. They hoped that the cumulative evidence, including the DNA on the knife, cell phone data, suspicious messages, and Antonio's behavior after the crime, would persuade the jury of his guilt. According to the prosecution's theory, the events unfolded as follows. When Zoe was returning to her car in the parking lot, Antonio approached her holding a knife. Threatening her with the weapon, he forced her to get into her own vehicle, after which he took the driver's seat. It is presumed that at that moment, Antonio was in a heavy emotional state due to the recent death of a close relative and was under the influence of a large amount of alcohol, as confirmed by his messages sent shortly before the incident. In this unstable condition, he decided to abduct Zoe with the intent to commit violent acts against her. The choice of victim was random. Zoe happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Antonio took advantage of the situation and the lack of witnesses in the parking lot to carry out his criminal plan. He drove the girl to a remote area near a creek surrounded by dense vegetation, making the location hidden from view and difficult for assistance or escape. In this secluded spot, Antonio forced Zoe out of the car and assaulted her. He then inflicted several knife wounds to her neck, leading to her death. Further, the perpetrator attempted to cover up his crime. He tried to push the car into the creek, likely intending to destroy any evidence left inside the vehicle. However, the car was only partially submerged, failing to completely conceal the traces of the crime. Realizing he had not fully covered his tracks, Antonio presumably wiped the steering wheel and door handles to remove his fingerprints before leaving the crime scene. The testimony from the first witness supports this version. That evening, he noticed a man resembling Antonio walking back towards the parking lot. The defense argued that most of the evidence presented by the prosecution could hardly be considered even circumstantial. For instance, the partial analysis of hair and semen only indicated that Antonio might have been one of the individuals whose genetic material matched the samples but did not confirm that he was the owner of the evidence. Regarding the DNA found on the knife handle, the defense contended that this evidence did not directly prove involvement in the murder. According to the defense, Antonio could have touched the knife under completely different circumstances. Before starting work at the grocery store, he had worked at a movie theater where he sometimes had to clean up forgotten items, including knives. He claimed this might have been when he left his fingerprints on the subsequently found murder weapon. However, this version could not be confirmed during the trial. No evidence or records supporting this scenario were found. Additionally, the defense noted that if someone else had taken the knife from the theater and used it to commit the crime, that person would have had to somehow avoid removing Antonio's DNA from the handle, which would be extremely difficult. Such a probability seemed unlikely and served as another argument for the defense to question the credibility of the charges. In this way, the defense aimed to create doubts in the jury's mind about the strength of the prosecution's evidence and undermine confidence in the collected evidence. The defense also tried to cast doubt on the credibility of the second witness, a homeless man named Gary. It was revealed during the investigation that Gary had an active arrest warrant for violating parole. The defense used this fact to attempt to exclude his testimony, arguing that Gary might have been motivated to distort facts in exchange for leniency from the police. However, the prosecution countered, emphasizing that the fact that a person with an active warrant voluntarily approached law enforcement demonstrated his sincere desire to help with the investigation. Prosecutors argued that such an action indicated Gary genuinely wanted to do the right thing, even knowing that his testimony might lead to his own arrest. Gary himself confirmed this, stating he was prepared to face the consequences but could not remain indifferent, knowing that his information could help solve a serious crime. Antonio's lawyers also attempted to convince the jury that at the time of Zoe's murder, their client was elsewhere, assisting a friend. However, this alibi remained unconfirmed. The defense could not provide convincing evidence to support this claim. Initially, the prosecution planned to seek the death penalty for Antonio, given the severity of the charges and the brutality of the crime. However, during the trial, it became evident that the existing evidence would make it challenging to secure such a verdict. The evidence collected against Antonio, although pointing to his involvement, was not strong or direct enough to justify the maximum penalty. Realizing this, the prosecution decided to forego seeking the death penalty, focusing instead on achieving a fair but realistic verdict based on the available evidence. After a lengthy deliberation, the jury ultimately reached a unanimous decision. The case was complex, and each juror carefully weighed all the presented evidence. In the end, after extended discussions, Antonio was found guilty of the murder of Zoe Hastings. In early 2018, taking into account all the circumstances of the case and the collected evidence, the court sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Zoe's parents expressed their deep gratitude to the investigators and all those involved in the trial for their efforts in achieving justice and holding the guilty party accountable. Her father, with a heavy heart, shared that he had always tried to teach his children to be cautious and aware of the dangers that might lurk in the world. He had done everything possible to protect his family, but his eldest daughter was abducted just a few hundred meters from their home, and at that moment, he felt powerless to change anything. This tragedy left an indelible mark on their lives, and they hope that Zoe's story will serve as a reminder of the importance of vigilance and that one should never take the safety of loved ones for granted. Karen Gregory was born on March 29, 1948, in Albany, New York. She was the eldest of 4 children and helped her parents take care of her siblings from a young age. The girl was into sports and spent a lot of time in nature. Additionally, she loved art and wanted to work in that field. After finishing high school, Karen enrolled in Nazareth College in Rochester, where she received a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Science degrees. After that, she worked as an art teacher in an elementary school for several years and then decided to become a graphic designer. In 1983, when she was 35 years old, she moved to Florida, where she met a man named David McKee. He worked as a manager in an organization that provided consulting services to Vietnam veterans, and he and Karen quickly became mutually attracted. The couple dated for just over a year, and in the spring of 1984, David asked her to move in with him in Gulfport. Before this, Karen lived in an apartment with her friend and she constantly had to drive to David's house. The woman accepted this offer and began gradually moving her things there. On May 22nd, Karen took the remaining items from her apartment and finally moved out completely. She told her neighbor that she was a little nervous. David had gone to another state for work to speak at a conference, and she would have to spend a whole week alone in his house. From the apartment, the woman went to her friend's house. They had a great time there. Karen told her friend that she was very happy with David and was glad she would finally be living with him. The friends talked until about midnight, after which Karen went to David's house. The next day, he called home several times, but no one answered. He thought Karen might have stayed in her old apartment and called her neighbor, but the woman said she hadn't seen her since yesterday. After that, David called several of Karen's friends and her sister, but none of them had seen her. He continued to try to reach her all day, but he never got an answer. On the next day, May 24th, David called home again early in the morning, hoping to catch Karen before she left for work, but there was still no answer. Later, he called her boss and found out that she had not shown up for work. At this point, David's concern reached its peak, and he feared that something bad may have happened to Karen. He then called local hospitals and police stations to inquire if they had seen anyone matching Karen's description. Upon learning that they had not, he decided to call his neighbor, Amy. David asked her, "Is Karen's car parked in front of the house?" Amy looked out the window and replied, "Yes." This only added to David's worry. He asked Amy to go to the house and knock on the door. He was so anxious that he stayed on the line with her until she left to fulfill his request. Amy approached the side door and knocked, but there was no answer. She then walked around the house and saw that one of the windows was open. She called out Karen's name several times, but there was no response. She extended her arm through the open window, pulled back the curtain, and was shocked by what she saw. The window was in the bedroom, and through it, she could see the hallway where a bloodied female body lay on the floor. Amy couldn't see the face because she was behind a wall, but she knew it was likely Karen. After recovering from the shock, Amy ran back to her own house where David was still on the phone. She grabbed the phone and told him that something terrible had happened before hanging up and calling 911. Doctors quickly arrived at the scene, but were only able to confirm Karen's death. Detectives began investigating the crime scene, which horrified even experienced police officers. Based on the amount of blood throughout the house, Karen had fought her attacker until the end. Bloodstains led from the hallway to the front door, where several fragments of glass had been smashed. Detectives noticed several strands of hair, matching Karen's hair color, stuck in the broken glass. They theorized that she had almost made it outside, but was caught by her attacker. In the bathroom, investigators found their first lead, a bloody footprint on the floor. Police checked Karen's feet and found no bloodstains, so the footprint must have belonged to her killer. However, it was unclear why the killer was walking around barefoot in the bathroom. Medical experts examined the victim's body and concluded that she had received about 20 stab wounds and had been subjected to violence. Experts also extracted biological material from the perpetrator. Unfortunately, DNA analysis was not used in 1984, so this clue could not help to identify the killer. In addition, several bloody fingerprints were found on her body, but they were too smeared to be used. According to experts, the woman was killed about 30 hours before she was discovered. This meant that she was attacked on the same night when she returned home from her friend's place. There was another detail that immediately caught the attention of the police and doctors as soon as they saw Karen's body. She was wearing a shirt, and a lace corset was on top of it. Apparently, the perpetrator did this. When the police finished examining the crime scene, and collected all possible clues, they allowed Karen's friends to start cleaning up. The women did not want David to see all this horror when he arrived. All the victim's acquaintances knew how much he loved her and wanted to ease his suffering at least a little. David's conference was taking place on the other side of the country, so he needed a lot of time to return home. Meanwhile, the detectives began questioning the neighbors. This area was considered quite prestigious and safe, and the crime rate was extremely low. Many residents knew each other, and they even had a neighborhood watch. This is a form of agreement between neighbors when they keep an eye on order and report any suspicious things to the police. However, in this case, the neighborhood watch did not perform its functions. Detectives found out that on May 23rd, at around 1:15 a.m., 16 residents of the area heard a piercing female scream, and none of them called the police. They all said the scream quickly stopped, and they did not get the impression that someone could be in danger. Even the head of the neighborhood watch, who lived practically opposite the victim, did not consider it necessary to call the police. He was fixing his motorcycle in the garage and listening to the radio when he heard a muffled scream. The man went out of the garage, walked down the street, and did not notice anything suspicious, after which he returned back. A neighbor who lived opposite David shared an interesting observation. On the morning of May 23rd, she saw that the front door of his house was open, and she also heard a scream that night, but did not associate it with the open door. In her story, there was one detail. When the police arrived on the call, the door was locked. Considering that the body had been in the house for about 30 hours, the culprit could have returned and tried to cover his tracks, including closing the door. It was noteworthy that there were no signs of forced entry on any of the doors. Detectives speculated that the perpetrator may have climbed in through the back window, but there were also no signs of forced entry there. Either Karen left it open all night, or she knew the killer and let him in herself. The head of the neighborhood watch shared another interesting observation with the detectives. On the evening of the day after Karen's murder, an unknown man pulled up to her house. He got out of the car, knocked on the door a few times, and kept looking around. Then he returned to the car, but a few minutes later, he came back with a piece of paper in his hand. He placed it on Karen's car windshield and only then drove away. The police immediately checked the car and indeed found a note on the windshield that said, "Karen and David, hi, I stopped by around 7:15 p.m. but didn't see any signs of life. I have a lot to do tonight, so I probably won't be back, but I have what you asked for." The detectives immediately noticed the wording, "No signs of life." Given that at the time this person arrived, Karen had been dead for almost a whole day, such a choice of words was very alarming. The note ended with the name Peter, and investigators tried to find him. It turned out that he had been right under their noses the whole time. Soon after the discovery of the body, the man learned about it from Karen's former neighbor and came to their house. The man cooperated actively and answered all the questions. He voluntarily provided his fingerprints and footprints and also told them what he was doing near the victim's house. According to Peter, a few days before this, Karen called him and invited him and David to dinner. But there was one detail. Karen supposedly told him that David would also be there, even though at the time he was already scheduled to go on a week-long business trip. The detectives also asked Peter what he meant in the note by the phrase, "I have what you asked for." The man said he borrowed a cassette from them and was planning to return it. Another strange detail was that Peter allegedly did not notice the glass shards almost all over the path to the front door, let alone the several broken windows. The man insisted that he hadn't seen anything or paid attention to it. During the conversation with him, one of the detectives noticed a large cut on Peter's hand. When the police officer looked at his hand, the man covered the spot and said that he always gets scratches after playing with dogs or repairing his car. All of the above looked extremely suspicious, and the detectives decided to check his alibi. Peter said that on the night of the murder, he was sleeping at home, and his neighbor confirmed this. The police didn't rush to exclude him from the list of suspects, since such an alibi could easily be a lie. However, the investigators quickly came up with another suspect, David, Karen's boyfriend. According to his words, that night he was in Rhode Island, which is located 2,000 kilometers away from his home, and he was sleeping in his hotel room. But at the crime scene, the police found a very interesting clue. A local Rhode Island newspaper dated May 23rd, the same day Karen was killed. It was very strange, and the detectives began to wonder if David could have flown to Florida, killed his girlfriend, and returned before his next conference appearance. They calculated the flight and travel times from airports and concluded that it was indeed possible. Additionally, no one could confirm David's alibi for that night since he had allegedly slept alone in his hotel room. The head of the neighborhood watch also shared his observations. He had repeatedly noticed that Karen and David argued when the woman came to his house. David, on the other hand, insisted that they had a wonderful relationship and the couple hardly ever fought. When David was asked about the newspaper, he said he bought it on May 21st at a store near his home. He was going to take it with him on the trip to have the weather forecast for the week. Investigators went to that store, and the clerk confirmed that they sold that newspaper. He even remembered that David bought it on the 21st. According to the clerk, the publication actually released that issue several days ago, which is normal for printed newspapers. Thus, suspicions against David faded into the background. They asked him if anything was missing from her house, and the man noticed the absence of a white lace corset that Karen had bought for herself a few months earlier, one very similar to the one worn by Karen's killer. This immediately led the detectives to think that the depraved criminal had taken it as a trophy. The police decided to pursue another lead found in the victim's house, a high-quality drawing of a watch signed with the name Stephen Fischler. One particular detail caught the detectives' attention. The paper appeared to be covered in blood. The detectives quickly discovered that Stephen worked with Karen in the same company and questioned her colleagues. They uncovered a lot of interesting information. Almost all the employees said that Stephen was a rather strange person. He persistently tried to court all the female colleagues, shared pictures with them depicting perverted things, and even wrote a perverted poem and tried to persuade his colleagues to read it. All the women who worked with him admitted that Stephen scared them. Karen also complained several times about his behavior, but management didn't give it much thought. The detectives talked to him, and the man denied giving Karen that drawing. He also claimed that he barely knew the victim and offered to take a polygraph test to prove his innocence. The investigators quickly organized such a test, and that's where the most interesting part began. At first, everything was calm, but after one of the questions, Stephen suddenly said that he killed Karen. Literally, a few seconds later, he took his words back and said that he had nothing to do with it. What was strange was that in both cases, the polygraph operator did not detect a lie. This confused the detectives, but they couldn't rely on the polygraph results. This instrument is far from perfect, and simply cannot accurately determine whether a person is lying or not. At the same time, they understood that Stephen was clearly a very strange person and could say anything. Soon, experts studied his drawing and concluded that the red stain on it was left by ketchup, not blood. As a result, they began to doubt whether Stephen was involved in Karen's murder. Despite such a number of suspects, the police still couldn't gather enough evidence against anyone, and the case remained unsolved for several months. Detectives continued to investigate, but they couldn't find any new leads. This continued until December, when something interesting happened. One of the respected residents of Gulfport was retiring, and in honor of this event, local residents organized special events. Many people attended, including a woman named Mary, who struck up a conversation with a police officer who was also present. During their conversation, they discussed the murder of Karen Gregory, and Mary inadvertently mentioned that she too had heard her piercing scream that night. The officer immediately noted one strange detail. Mary lived 2 blocks away from Karen's house, and initially, the police didn't even interview residents of such distant houses. The fact that the woman heard the scream indicated that it was really very loud. However, the head of the neighborhood watch, who lived practically opposite Karen's house, described it as muffled. But if the neighbors 2 blocks away heard it, the man clearly could not consider it quiet, especially since at that moment he was in his garage with the door open. All this raised doubts, but the police were not quick to suspect the head of the neighborhood watch. He was 22-year-old George Lewis. He worked as a firefighter and was a good friend of almost all the employees of the local police station. He lived with his wife and young child, and all the neighbors spoke of him as a reliable and decent person. Nevertheless, detectives could not ignore Mary's story. They called George and asked him to come to the station when he had time. The man agreed, but never showed up. It is worth noting that before this, he regularly stopped by the station just to chat with his friends. The chief detective in this case was even at his wedding, so it was difficult for him to imagine George as a killer. Only a month later, in January 1985, they managed to talk to him. George insisted that the scream did not seem very loud to him. Perhaps this was due to the music playing from the radio. The detective asked him if he remembered anything else from that night, but George told him the same thing, except for one moment. When his testimony was taken for the first time, he said that he heard the scream, went out of the garage and walked down the street. But this time, he stated, he just walked up to the road, looked around, and then returned. Considering that many months had passed since then, this discrepancy in the testimonies did not seem serious. However, the police still decided to make sure that he was telling the truth and offered to undergo a polygraph test. George agreed, but to their surprise, he did not pass it. In a subsequent conversation with detectives, the man admitted that he had hidden one fact from them. He claimed that on the night Karen disappeared, he saw an unknown man near her house. George could only remember that the man was tall and had red hair and a beard. The detectives once again doubted whether he was telling the truth. George could not explain why he had not mentioned this man during the initial interview, except that he was afraid because the man knew where he lived and could harm his family. Despite this, the police tried to follow up on this lead and find the man, but the result was zero. Another nuance was that there was almost 30 meters between George and Karen's houses, and it was pitch dark outside. The detectives doubted that the man could see the color of another person's hair under such conditions, but George insisted on his story. The police recreated the events of that night and asked George to describe the man who stood 30 meters away from him. He could not see any details, which made the detectives even more suspicious of his words. Nevertheless, They walked around the area and asked local residents, "Have you noticed a suspicious man with red hair who could walk on their streets at night?" To their surprise, several women admitted that they had occasionally seen a man looking into their windows in the dark. None of them saw the face of this man, but one woman managed to notice him, and according to her, he looked very much like George Lewis. She was not 100% sure because it was dark outside, and the man immediately ran away. George admitted that he did sometimes look into his neighbor's windows, but he insisted that he did it solely for their safety. He said he was just trying to make sure everything was okay with them, since he was responsible for the security of his neighborhood as the head of the neighborhood watch. But all this only strengthened the suspicion against him. In March 1985, George agreed to a second polygraph test. This time, he changed his story again. He admitted that not only did he see a man in front of Karen's house, but he also approached him to talk, and the man threatened to kill him if he told anyone about him. The polygraph operator once again detected a lie, so the investigator asked George directly, "Did he kill Karen Gregory?" The man answered negatively, and once again, his words were considered false. Afterwards, the detectives decided to talk to George's wife, who told them that she had woken up that night from a piercing scream and was very frightened. She had tried to find her husband and went to the garage, but he was not there, and the light in the garage was turned off. The woman then returned home and sat in the kitchen, waiting for her husband, who only returned half an hour later. The detectives also decided to delve into George's biography and spoke with his ex-wife, who admitted that the man only seemed kind, caring, and responsible. In reality, he was very aggressive and raised his hand to her during frequent arguments. She added that he even choked her sometimes. Afterwards, the investigator spoke with George's close friends, who also shared some interesting information. Several months before the murder, when Karen was not yet living with him, but periodically visited him, George told his friends that he liked her. Moreover, the detectives learned that the man sometimes participated in orgies and mentioned that he wanted Karen to join them. During these conversations with George's friends, the police also learned that in the summer of 1984, the man had a secret affair with a young woman who lived a few houses away from him. They spoke with her and learned something else. The young woman admitted that on her 17th birthday, George gave her a white lace corset. It was too big for her, but the man still made her wear it regularly. The police asked her to give them the corset and immediately showed it to Karen's boyfriend. He said that an identical corset had gone missing from the house and that its size matched Karen's. It was the first serious evidence against George, but the detectives continued to dig further. They took a footprint from him and sent it to FBI experts to compare it to the footprint found on the bathroom floor in Karen's house. After some time, the results came in. A complete match. In March 1986, George was called back to the police station, and the detectives asked several times, was he in Karen's house on the night of the murder? The man denied it until the detective told him about the result of the examination. For the next few minutes, George continued to deny everything. But then he gave the police a new story. This time he said that he saw a red-haired man near Karen's house, then ran to her house and saw that everything around was bloody, and the woman was lying in the hallway with a cut on her throat. Afterwards, he panicked and ran away from there, deciding never to remember that horror again. Of course, detectives didn't believe his story for a second because it sounded completely unbelievable. But George was right about one thing. There was indeed a cut on the victim's throat. which hadn't been disclosed publicly. Even if his story was true, he wouldn't have been able to see the cut due to the large amount of blood on Karen's body. At least experienced medical experts couldn't see it until the blood was washed away. This meant that George could only know about the cut if he was the killer. All of the above was enough to finally arrest the man. He was taken into custody on March 15, almost 2 years after the murder. In the state of Florida, he could have faced the death penalty for what he did. George's close friends and colleagues in the fire department didn't share the police's certainty that he was the killer. They still considered him a good person and made every effort to help him. These people gave part of their salary to George's wife and child and even raised $300,000 for bail. Several of his colleagues even mortgaged their homes. As a result, George was released in late December. He lived in his house for another 6 months, and the trial didn't begin until June 4, 1987. George's lawyers insisted that the man hadn't killed anyone and never changed his version of events in conversations with the police. However, when the suspect was given the floor, he came up with a completely new story. Its beginning was the same. He saw a man near Karen's residence, ran into the house, and saw her body. This sight made George very sick, and he ran to the bathroom where he vomited. Apparently, this was how he tried to explain the bloody footprint of his foot in the bathroom. But there was one obvious nuance here. If he had originally run into Karen's house barefoot, the bloody traces would have been from where he found her body to the bathroom, but they weren't there. When asked why he didn't call the police, George said that he was only 22 years old at the time and was too scared to tell anyone about it. It's worth noting that the man had been a firefighter since he was 18 and regularly dealt with horrific situations at work. But when he saw his dead neighbor, he suddenly couldn't even call the police. The prosecution insisted that George had feelings for Karen for several months. He waited until her boyfriend left for a week and decided to take advantage of the situation. George broke into her house and attacked her. Although the woman managed to scream and even resist him, in the end he killed her and subjected her to violence. As for the footprint of his foot on the bathroom floor, there could be a simple explanation. According to his wife, George came home only half an hour after the scream. Apparently, he tried to wash his clothes stained with Karen's blood in the bathroom and took off his shoes with socks, which also got blood on them. The trial lasted for 2 weeks, and in the end, the jury found him guilty. A month later, when his sentence was due to be announced, the judge suddenly scheduled a retrial. George's lawyers pushed for this, and they succeeded. They insisted that some evidence had been compromised by the police, and the prosecution had not been able to fully prove their client's guilt. The judge's decision came as a shock to all participants in the process, as it rarely happens. However, the prosecutor was able to challenge this decision, and in 1989, it was overturned. In the end, George was sentenced to life in prison. The death penalty was ruled out because the man had no criminal history prior to the murder. Since then, George has tried to challenge his sentence several times, but has been denied each time. Many of his friends and relatives continued to believe that he was innocent despite all the facts and evidence against him. George died in prison in 2014 at the age of 52. He insisted on his innocence until the very end and even gave an interview in which he talked about how difficult it was to bear the punishment for a crime he did not commit. In this whole story, one important point should be noted. 16 neighbors heard Karen scream, but none of them dared to call the police. Given that the police station was located near their street, the patrol could have arrived at the scene in a matter of minutes. The detectives who worked on this case admitted that in such a case, Karen's life could have been saved, but it did not happen. Tristan Bailey was a joyful and energetic 13-year-old girl living in St. John's, Florida. She was born on January 18, 2008, in St. John's, Florida. She grew up in a large and close-knit family that always supported her in her passions and endeavors. Her parents, Forrest and Stacy Bailey, were devoted and loving parents who raised their children in an atmosphere of care and mutual understanding. Tristan had 4 siblings, 2 older brothers, Tegan and Britton, an older sister, Alexis, and a younger sister, Sophia. The Bailey family was known for their strong bonds and close family ties. They often spent time together, participating in various family activities and supporting each other in all their pursuits. Tristan was especially close to her older sister, Alexis, who served as a role model for her. They shared many interests, and Alexis always supported her younger sister, inspiring her to achieve new heights. The entire family was deeply religious and actively involved in the life of their local community. Tristan Bailey was a cheerful and energetic girl. Her friends and family described her as a bright and kind person who always tried to help others and provide support in difficult moments. Tristan was a student at a local school and was actively involved in cheerleading, which was one of her main passions. She was known for her determination and discipline, always giving her all in everything she did. In her school community, Tristan stood out not only for her athletic achievements but also for her friendly nature. She easily made friends and maintained warm relationships with those around her. Her positive attitude and sincerity made her a favorite among her peers and teachers. May 9, 2021, began like any other Sunday. Tristan was spending time with her family. It was Mother's Day, and for the Bailey family, as for many others, it was a special day filled with warmth and togetherness. In the evening, Tristan met with friends, a typical activity for an active and sociable girl. However, she did not return home as expected later that evening. Her family became worried when they realized she was running late. Attempts to reach her by phone were unsuccessful, and her parents' anxiety grew. As night fell and Tristan still had not returned, the Bailey family decided to contact the police. Local authorities immediately launched a search, joining forces with volunteers and community members. They combed the surrounding area, reached out to neighbors and friends in search of information on where Tristan might have gone. The search continued throughout the night and into the next morning. It soon became clear that the situation was serious and that her disappearance was not accidental. By noon on May 10, 2021, after hours of searching, Tristan's body was discovered in a wooded area near her home. This news was shocking and tragic for her family and the community. A day that began as a typical celebration ended in an unspeakable tragedy that shook not only the Bailey family but the entire nation. In a statement, the sheriff carefully avoided revealing too many details, reassuring that the police were actively investigating and urging journalists to respect the privacy of the grieving family during this difficult time. However, it soon became known to the press that the case involved murder, a revelation that deeply shocked the local community. For residents of this prestigious neighborhood, crimes were rare, and such a brutal act of violence seemed unthinkable. Hundreds of people gathered, shocked by the event, to show support for Tristan's family and pay their respects. Dozens of local residents voluntarily provided the police with surveillance footage from cameras installed on their homes, hoping these materials would aid in the investigation. Everyone was consumed with one thought: who could commit such a heinous crime against an innocent child? As it turned out, these recordings indeed played a crucial role in the investigation, helping law enforcement track down the perpetrator. On the morning of May 9th, surveillance cameras near the Durban Crossing Sports Complex captured Tristan in the company of an unknown young man. At first glance, he appeared to be around her age. The boy was wearing shorts and a light-colored hoodie. Half an hour later, another camera, installed on Saddlestone Drive, again captured them walking toward a dead-end street that ended in a wooded area. Almost 2 hours later, the same camera captured the same young man, but this time Tristan was no longer with him. He was returning alone, carrying his shoes in his hands. This immediately caught the attention of the police, as it seemed extremely strange. The young man walked the same route, but in the opposite direction, raising even more questions from the investigators, as this unexpected action could be related to something much more serious. The police quickly identified the young man as 14-year-old Aiden Fucci, a classmate of Tristan's who lived just a few blocks away from her. Aiden Fucci was born and raised in St. John's, Florida, leading what appeared to be the ordinary life of a teenager. He attended the same school as Tristan and lived in the same neighborhood. Aiden grew up in a typical middle-class American family. He had friends and classmates with whom he socialized and spent time. At first glance, there was nothing that set him apart from his peers. Detectives arrived at Aiden Fucci's home intending to ask him a few questions. The main question was, why was he walking barefoot on a street so close to the location where Tristan's murder had taken place? Aiden explained that he had a blister on his foot and decided to walk home without shoes. However, this explanation did not satisfy the police, and they decided to search his home. After obtaining the necessary warrant, the police began their search and found the very clothes Aiden was seen wearing in the surveillance footage near Tristan. Some of these items had visible blood stains, which significantly heightened the suspicion of his involvement in the crime. The next day, on May 11th, the sheriff officially announced Aiden Fucci's arrest. Following his arrest, some of Aiden's acquaintances described him as a withdrawn and sometimes aggressive teenager. On social media and messaging platforms, he occasionally shared dark thoughts and interests related to violence. He had certain behavioral issues at school, although nothing that pointed to a propensity for serious crimes. After his arrest and the start of the investigation, it became known that Aiden had begun showing an unhealthy interest in the topic of violence and murder. Investigators found that he often discussed ideas related to killings with friends and even made drawings on the subject. This shocked the public and raised questions about what might have led the teenager to such a horrific act. His case became one of the most talked about in the country, sparking widespread public debate and raising concerns about teenage violence, mental health, and the influence of environment on young people's behavior. At that moment, the police kept many details of the investigation secret, and the public was in a state of deep shock. How could it be that a 14-year-old was involved in such a horrifying crime? Shortly after his arrest, Aiden committed an act that further shocked people. He posted a photo from the back of a police car on Snapchat. In the photo, he took a selfie and added a chilling caption that seemed especially disturbing in light of the events. "Hey guys, has anybody seen Tristan lately?" Aiden's post caused a wave of outrage and shock, as his message was perceived as mocking the tragic death of Tristan. For many residents of the area, this post became a kind of confirmation that Aiden was indeed involved in her death. Shortly thereafter, the police department reported that during his interrogation, Aiden repeatedly changed his statements, which only increased the investigators' suspicions and strengthened their belief in his involvement in the crime. Detectives also revealed horrifying details about Tristan's murder. The girl had been stabbed 114 times with a sharp object, clearly indicating that the crime was not only intentional but also meticulously planned. The killer had clearly prepared for the attack. Although the police were unable to find the murder weapon in Aiden's home, search teams soon discovered a knife submerged at the bottom of a local pond. Experts determined that this knife had been used in the murder, but due to its prolonged submersion in water, they were unable to retrieve fingerprints from the handle. To convincingly link Aiden to this heinous crime, the police needed more substantial evidence than just a suspicious camera recording or his strange behavior following the arrest. And soon, that evidence was found. For several days, experts worked tirelessly to carefully examine the items seized by the police from the suspect's home. DNA traces of Tristan Bailey were found on Aiden's shoes and shirt, which the police had confiscated during the search. These findings became key in the investigation. The investigators obtained irrefutable evidence linking Aiden to the crime scene and his victim. DNA analysis conclusively confirmed that the clothing found at Aiden's home bore traces of Tristan's blood, which became a decisive factor in establishing his guilt. Ultimately, the police gathered a compelling set of evidence sufficient to bring the case to trial. However, the investigators managed to obtain something even more significant: a partial confession from the teenager. Aiden confessed that he and Tristan were indeed walking together through the streets, and at some point, a conflict arose between them. According to him, during the argument, he pushed the girl, she fell, and hit her head on the ground. After that, Aiden claimed that he simply went home. However, this version of events seemed highly doubtful, given the numerous contradictions and the overwhelming evidence against him. Many believe that such a story might have been concocted by his lawyer in an attempt to reduce Aiden's culpability to a charge of manslaughter. However, with the weight of the evidence, this strategy appeared doomed to fail. Further investigation, during which the police interviewed Aiden's classmates and friends, led to the discovery of another shocking fact. This fact added even more grim shades to the overall picture and strengthened suspicions that Tristan's murder was not just a random incident, but a carefully planned act of cruelty. The teenager had repeatedly stated that he intended to take someone into the woods and kill them, but no one in his circle took these words seriously. Neither his friends nor acquaintances considered it necessary to report this to parents or the police, believing that Aiden was just joking. As it turned out later, he openly shared his dark intentions, but those around him did not take them seriously. Once the true nature of his threats became apparent, it was clear that these were not just casual words, but an expression of real intent. Given the public outcry and the wave of outrage sparked by the crime, the police and courts acted as swiftly and decisively as possible. Law enforcement understood the need to bring the case to a close as quickly as possible and ensure that justice was served for this horrific crime. The first court hearing for Aiden Fucci, held on May 11, 2021, was extremely tense and attracted significant public interest. At this hearing, Aiden faced the court on charges of murdering Tristan Bailey, a 13-year-old schoolgirl whose death shocked the entire state of Florida and sparked a wave of sympathy and anger across the country. Aiden Fucci participated in the hearing remotely via video link from a juvenile detention center. On the screen, he appeared confused and tense. The judge read out the charges against him, carefully explaining the seriousness of the crimes he was accused of. Aiden was charged with second-degree murder, which could later be upgraded to first-degree murder as more evidence emerged. During the hearing, the judge also discussed the issue of custody and the possibility of bail. However, given the severity of the crime and the risk to society, the court ruled that Aiden would remain in custody without the option of bail. Tristan Bailey's parents, who were present at the hearing, looked devastated and drained, but they were determined to seek justice for their daughter. Aiden's lawyers, in turn, insisted that their client needed a psychological evaluation to determine his mental state and ability to understand his actions at the time of the crime. The hearing was brief but set the tone for the upcoming trial. Aiden Fucci was sent back into custody, and the next hearing was scheduled for a later date, at which the court would review all the collected evidence and testimonies. A week after the trial began, Aiden's lawyer suddenly filed a motion to withdraw from the case without disclosing specific reasons for the decision. However, many speculated that the reason might have been quite clear: not every lawyer is capable of calmly defending someone accused of such a heinous crime. As a result, Aiden was assigned a public defender who continued his defense. Meanwhile, public outrage continued to grow. Residents of the town and people from other regions actively expressed their dissatisfaction by sending petitions to the prosecutor's office and the governor's office. People demanded that Aiden be tried as an adult and that the charge be upgraded to first-degree murder. Within days, the petition gathered over 700,000 signatures, demonstrating the scale of public outrage. Under public pressure and considering the nature of the crime, the court on May 27 ruled in favor of all points in the petition. On May 29, the court hearing for Aiden Fucci drew significant attention from both the press and the public. The proceedings took place in an atmosphere of tense anticipation, as the fate of the teenager accused of a brutal murder was at stake. Aiden appeared in court in person this time, rather than via video link as in the previous hearing. The courtroom was filled with journalists, relatives of Tristan Bailey, and people deeply concerned about the outcome of the case. Aiden appeared withdrawn and subdued, aware that he would have to answer for his actions before the court. Aiden Fucci's lawyer attempted to portray him as a teenager under stress, emphasizing that his client was only 14 years old and that his mental state required careful consideration. The defense insisted on the need for an additional psychological evaluation to determine Aiden's condition at the time of the crime. However, the prosecution presented a detailed account of the crime, focusing on its brutality and premeditation. The prosecutor reminded the court of the 114 stab wounds inflicted on Tristan and emphasized that this was not a random attack but a carefully planned murder. He also mentioned the evidence found on Aiden's clothing, including the victim's DNA. The hearings lasted several hours, with each side striving to convince the court of their position. After the presentations were completed, the judge announced that the case would continue to be examined thoroughly before a final verdict was issued. During this time, Aiden was held in a special unit of an adult prison but isolated from other inmates. When a minor is tried as an adult, they are always held separately from other prisoners. This rule is designed to protect minors from potential threats posed by adult inmates. On June 4th, Aiden's lawyer filed a document in court declaring his client's innocence. This meant that the trial would have to prove his guilt, despite the public's belief in an inevitable guilty verdict. However, the following day, a more shocking development occurred. Aiden's mother was arrested for attempting to conceal evidence. On May 10th, the day Aiden was taken in for questioning, his mother, aware of the possible consequences, washed his clothes, which were later found to have bloodstains. The prosecutor, commenting on the situation to journalists, emphasized that he would seek a real prison sentence for her for tampering with evidence. Notably, Aiden's mother's actions were captured on surveillance cameras. The footage showed her washing the clothes, although the video quality did not allow for all details to be seen. As for Aiden himself, something strange happened. The court hearing for Aiden Fucci on September 1st attracted significant attention as it was expected to shed light on the future course of the case. However, the hearing turned out to be unusual and raised many questions. Unexpectedly, the young man began talking about demons, incoherently asking where he was and what was happening around him. During the hearing, Aiden Fucci behaved strangely, which was immediately noticed by those present in the courtroom and those following the proceedings in the news. Throughout the session, he appeared distracted, nervously glancing around several times, and seemed unable to focus on what was happening in the courtroom. At one point, he began muttering under his breath, which puzzled those in attendance. The strangest moment came when Aiden suddenly started laughing loudly, despite the seriousness of the situation. His behavior was clearly out of the ordinary and was noticed by both the lawyers and the judge. The judge issued a warning, after which Fucci's lawyer attempted to explain his behavior as nervous tension and emotional instability. These events raised doubts about the teenager's mental state and whether he fully understood the seriousness of his situation. The defense emphasized that Aiden required additional psychological evaluation to determine his mental state at the time of the crime and during the court sessions. His behavior seemed too abrupt and unnatural, leading many to suspect that he might be feigning mental instability as a manipulative tactic. The hearing was postponed to allow for a more detailed assessment of Fucci's mental state, adding uncertainty to the future of the trial. According to reports from journalists, a court psychologist who was not directly involved in Aiden's case expressed his opinion about Aiden's behavior. The specialist noted that, in his observation, the suspect's behavior did not appear to be feigned. Additional circumstances only heightened concern. A notebook with drawings of satanic runes was found in Aiden's cell, and his girlfriend told investigators that he had repeatedly complained of hearing voices in his head that allegedly urged him to kill someone. All of this appeared very suspicious. Questions arose because Aiden had behaved normally for several months after his arrest, but suddenly, at one point, he began to show complete disorientation, forgetting where he was, and started talking about demons. This sudden change in behavior raises the question of whether he is trying to avoid prison by these means. Let's not forget his mocking selfie taken in the police car, where he openly taunted Tristan's death. Such behavior could only be displayed by a cold-blooded person devoid of any compassion. Or perhaps it was the voices in his head that compelled him to make that post. Of course, he was assigned a medical examination, which ultimately provided a conclusion about his mental state. On October 28th, the trial of Aiden Fucci marked another significant stage in this high-profile case. The hearing took place in a tense atmosphere as the public and media closely followed every twist and turn of the process. Aiden, who was 15 years old at the time, appeared in court again, where the results of the psychological evaluation in the future course of the case were discussed. Representatives of both the prosecution and defense were present in the courtroom, along with Tristan Bailey's parents, who watched the proceedings with pain in their eyes. The psychological evaluation, conducted earlier, revealed that Aiden was sane and fully aware of his actions at the time of the crime. This conclusion was a blow to the defense, which had been attempting to argue the possibility of a mental disorder in the teenager. The hearing also reviewed additional evidence gathered during the investigation. Prosecutors presented new facts confirming that the murder was premeditated and committed with extreme cruelty. In particular, recordings from his prison cell, satanic symbols found in his notebook, and witness testimonies that Aiden had previously spoken about his dark thoughts and desire to kill someone were all examined. The defense, in turn, continued to insist that Aiden needed further psychological help and that his age and emotional state should be considered in sentencing. The hearing lasted several hours, with tension in the courtroom escalating with each statement. Eventually, the judge decided to continue the case, scheduling the next hearing date. The trial of Aiden Fucci concluded with a verdict in March 2023. Aiden Fucci was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The court considered the extreme cruelty with which the crime was committed, as well as the fact that it was premeditated. The judge emphasized that although Aiden was a teenager at the time of the crime, his actions demonstrated such a high degree of brutality that the maximum sentence was deemed justified. The court's decision was an important step in the case of Tristan Bailey and serves as a reminder of the severe consequences of violence, even when committed by young people. The court also rejected any attempts by the defense to mitigate the sentence based on Aiden's age or possible mental health issues, insisting that none of these factors could excuse the crime he committed. Aiden Fucci is not eligible for an appeal or parole, meaning he will remain in prison for the rest of his life. Shauna Tiafe was born on March 13, 1966, in Salt Lake City, USA. She was a cheerful and energetic woman, a member of the school cheerleading team, and had many friends. After completing her education, Shauna worked for some time in her home state, but at the age of 29, she decided to move to Las Vegas. She liked the vibrant pace of the city, which offered many more opportunities to earn money. After moving, Shauna worked as a cosmetic salesperson in several elite firms, but in 2001 she decided to become a waitress at the Palms Casino. At that time, the establishment had just opened, but it quickly became one of the most popular casinos in Vegas. It was at this job that Shauna met her future husband, George. He often visited the casino, and a romance quickly developed between them. A year after they met, the couple had a daughter, Madison. A few years later, they officially got married. It seemed that this family had a happy and carefree future ahead of them. George worked as a firefighter, paid a lot of attention to his wife and daughter, and always took care of them. Shauna worked at the casino, earning quite decent money there, but in 2008, their relationship began to deteriorate. Due to the financial crisis, George lost a considerable portion of his savings, which were invested in real estate. On this basis, he became nervous and irritable, increasingly venting his anger on his wife and daughter. Eventually, the woman decided that they should live separately for some time and moved into her own apartment. The couple went to a family psychologist, but no improvements were observed in their relationship, and they increasingly discussed divorce. Another blow to Shauna was that her apartment was robbed. While she was at work, several valuable items were taken from her home, including her engagement ring. But a strange separate detail was that the thief also took her panties, leaving men's underwear in the apartment. The woman reported the incident to the police, but they could not identify the perpetrator. On the morning of September 29, 2012, 3 weeks after the incident, George picked up his daughter from her grandmother and went to Shauna's apartment to retrieve some of the girl's belongings. They continued to share custody of their daughter, and she was supposed to spend a few days with him. As they approached the apartment, they saw that the garage door was open. When they entered the apartment, they were met with a gruesome sight. Shauna was lying on the floor, blood everywhere. Her 8-year-old daughter witnessed a horrific scene. George immediately called the police and reported what had happened. The 911 operator asked them to go outside with the woman and wait for the officers. Investigators began to study the crime scene and determined that Shauna was likely attacked near the stairs on the second floor of the apartment. The house was in complete chaos. Many things were scattered and broken, indicating a struggle between the victim and the perpetrator. Medical experts found serious injuries on Shauna's body and initially thought that her death may have been caused by a gunshot wound. However, they soon realized that all these injuries were inflicted by a heavy, blunt object, most likely a hammer. After interviewing neighbors, the police received 2 leads between 3:30 and 4 a.m. One of the residents in the same building heard some noise from the woman's apartment. He didn't pay much attention to it because he knew that Shauna was coming home from work at that time. Another neighbor found her phone, documents, and cosmetics on a nearby street, which indicated that the perpetrator either intentionally threw them away while fleeing the apartment or accidentally dropped them. Investigators reconstructed the timeline of events that night. On surveillance cameras at the casino and its parking lot, they saw Shauna finishing her shift and leaving for the parking lot. Nothing on the footage indicated that the woman was alarmed or in any danger. Detectives concluded that the killer was likely already in her apartment when she returned home. As usual, the first suspicion fell on her husband, George. The police have already found out that the couple was getting ready for a divorce. They also talked to Shauna's friends and learned about the problems in their relationship. Everything looked as if he really fit the role of the killer. However, the detective found that the man had an unquestionable alibi for that night. He was on a 12-hour shift at the fire department. This was confirmed by all his colleagues and camera recordings. Thus, the police did not have any serious clues. They immediately learned that the woman's apartment was robbed 3 weeks earlier and tried to understand if there was any connection between these events. The version was being developed that the robber might have returned, but did not have time to leave the house before Shauna arrived. A struggle broke out between them, and he killed her. Meanwhile, the victim's sister continued to suspect George in what had happened. She was constantly talking to Shauna and knew about all the problems in their relationship, about his constant jealousy and scandals. However, his alibi was unquestionable. Therefore, the police focused on searching for other clues. A day after the discovery of the body, they received the first serious lead. By that time, the killer was being talked about in all the local news, which drew the attention of Vegas residents. A man who knew a homeless person called Greyhound turned to the police. He told this witness that he killed the woman with a hammer. According to the man, Greyhound talked about it with joy and even laughed. Given that the details of the murder were not disclosed in the media, this lead became key for the detectives. They found out that the witness lived in a tent on the outskirts of the city and often met with Greyhound near the Albertson store. Together with him, they went there and started waiting. Very soon, the witness saw him and reported to the police, who immediately approached the suspect. During the search, they found banned substances on him, which allowed them to arrest Greyhound. In the police station, the officers found out that his real name was Noel Stevens. He had been repeatedly convicted of petty thefts and possession of various substances, but the man denied his involvement in the murder, and the investigators really doubted his candidacy as a suspect. First, he only committed minor offenses, and it was difficult to imagine why this homeless person would kill someone. Secondly, he lived practically at the other end of the city, which made the choice of the victim completely incomprehensible. It took him several hours to get to Shauna's house, while many really valuable things in her apartment were untouched, including cash. None of this made any sense. However, the police continued to investigate his involvement. They found a tent where Stevens lived and conducted a search. The tent was located outside the city in a remote desert area. While examining the area around it, investigators found several significant pieces of evidence. Just a few meters away, they discovered the suspect's pants and underwear covered in blood, as well as a hammer tag. Later, experts determined that the blood belonged to Shauna TFA. However, the main clue was waiting for them at the police station. By gaining access to Noel's smartphone, they found only one contact in his notebook: George TFA's number. At this point, the case took an unexpected turn. From conversations with Shauna's friends and relatives, investigators learned that George had been friends with a homeless man for several years, whom he entrusted with various household and yard work. The woman often complained about him to her acquaintances when he came to fix something. According to her, he behaved strangely and even creepily, but George never took her concerns seriously. Thus, detectives found the missing link between the killer and the victim. But the main question remained whether George had any involvement in this, or if Stevens chose the woman as a victim simply because he knew Shauna and her work schedule. With the help of the hammer tag, the police found out when and where the hammer, which was most likely the murder weapon, was purchased. By requesting surveillance camera footage, they were shocked to see Stevens and George TFA walking into the store and buying the same hammer. At this point, investigators realized that Shauna's husband could indeed be the mastermind behind this horrific murder. When all this evidence was presented to Stevens, he finally decided to confess to what he had done. The man admitted that he did indeed kill Shauna, but only on the orders of her husband. According to Stevens, George paid him $600 for it. They had been planning this crime for several months. The man bought dark clothes for Stevens and gave him a duplicate of the keys to her apartment. 3 weeks before the murder, he asked the homeless man to break into her house and stage a robbery so that later the police would be confused and conduct their investigation along that line. On the night of the murder, Stevens snuck into her apartment again and waited for the woman to come home. After she arrived and began to walk up to the second floor, he came out of his hiding place and attacked her. Stevens said he struck her about 17 times, causing the hammer to break. The killer agreed to show detectives the location near a campsite where he buried his weapon. With Stevens' confession and a multitude of evidence, the police charged George. His relatives were shocked because he had always been a caring and loving family man who helped people. Upon learning of the accusations, George's sister called him and told him that he was suspected of murder. Immediately after the call, he got into his pickup truck and tried to leave town. However, at the exit, the man crashed into a fence and flew off the road. The police who arrived at the scene concluded that he deliberately caused the accident in an attempt to take his own life, and there were no tire marks on the path of the car. George did not even try to brake, but only pressed on the gas pedal. However, he did not succeed in his goal. With medium injuries, the man was taken to the local hospital. 2 days later, the police informed him that he was arrested for murder. George's reaction was very calm. He asked to contact his lawyer and also to allow him to take a shower and brush his teeth. From that moment on, the police department began preparing to transfer the case to court. 3 months later, Noel Stevens agreed to make a full confession in exchange for a waiver of the death penalty. George TFA refused to admit his guilt, and the trial against him only began 3 years later in August 2015. At the hearings, he did not utter a word, entrusting all the work to his lawyer. His relatives acted as witnesses and spoke about how George could never have done such a thing to his wife and could not be involved in her murder. His defense was based on the fact that Stevens killed Shauna on his own initiative, and her husband knew nothing about it. According to the lawyer, the store camera footage did not prove anything. It only showed how George and Noel were buying tools that the latter needed for housework. The prosecution did not believe in such a scenario. In court, they presented a printout of George's phone calls, according to which the man called Stevens 87 times in September 2012, 5 of which were made shortly before the murder. Based on Stevens' testimony, the prosecution concluded that money was the motive for the murder. George lost a significant portion of his savings due to the crisis, resulting in Shauna becoming the main breadwinner in the family. She earned over $100,000 a year, while George's income was only half that amount. He realized that in the event of a divorce or property division, he would be left with nothing, so he decided to get rid of his wife. Stevens initially didn't believe him when he spoke about the murder. Prior to this, they had been friends for several years, and Noel had actually done various work around the house and property for a small fee. In the end, George offered him $5,000 to kill his wife, and he agreed. According to his testimony, the man planned to get this money from an insurance company after Shauna's death. Despite Stevens revealing all the details of the murder and how he and George planned the crime, there were certain difficulties during the trial. The results of Stevens' medical examination were presented during the hearing, which showed that the man often suffered from visual and auditory hallucinations and regularly took potent banned substances. He did not deny either of these points, so all of his words were questioned by the defense lawyer. Because of this, neither side was sure of the outcome when the jurors began to deliberate. It took them 3 days. In the end, George TFA was found guilty of conspiring to commit murder. When the judge pronounced these words, George showed no emotion. He was sentenced to life in prison with an additional 81 years for the remaining charges, including conspiracy to break into a home and robbery. Soon after the verdict, George filed a 107-page appeal in which he confessed to the crime in the third person. He wrote that prescription drugs had clouded his mind, causing him to be unable to distinguish between good and evil. All of this led him to believe that killing his wife would be the only way to protect their child. George revealed that he had suffered a serious injury several years before the murder, but the court did not appoint a psychological examination for him. Despite this, in 2017, the court rejected his appeal because there was no reason to doubt that his mental state prevented him from clearly understanding what was happening. Since George's arrest, their daughter has been living with her maternal grandmother and has been actively helped by her sister Shauna. At one point, this girl lost both of her parents and learned what a monster her father was. He deliberately took her to the apartment, knowing in advance what she would see. Obviously, he did this to provide a more reliable alibi without caring about the consequences for his child's mental health. As for Stevens, he received a 42-year prison sentence. Considering that this man spent most of his life on the streets, it would be foolish to consider such a sentence as punishment. Helen McCourt was born on July 29, 1965, in the English town of Bootle. Soon she had a younger brother, and from an early age, the girl helped take care of him. Later, their parents divorced, her mother married another man, and they, along with Helen and her brother, moved to a small village called Billing. Located near the city, it was a quiet, peaceful place where not a single serious crime could occur for decades. The locals knew each other well and were not afraid that something bad could happen in their village. Helen grew up in this peaceful environment, had many friends, and was an exemplary daughter. After graduating from school, she got a job at an insurance company located in Liverpool. The young woman stayed in Billing, so she had to get to the office by train and bus. On February 9, 1988, when Helen was 22 years old, she went to work as usual. She had agreed to have lunch with her mother that day since her mother worked just a few streets away from her. However, the weather suddenly turned bad that day with strong winds and rain, so they decided to postpone their lunch. Her mother came home significantly earlier, and Helen called her towards the end of her shift. She told her mother that she had planned to go on a date that evening and asked her to heat up dinner for her arrival so that she could wash her hair. Usually, Helen returned home just after 5 p.m., but that day she was clearly delayed, and her mother began to worry. However, soon after, the news reported that a fallen tree on one of the railroad lines, due to the bad weather, had temporarily paralyzed the train service. By 7 p.m., her mother began to worry again and decided to call the railroad service. She explained the situation, but the operator stated that the fallen tree had blocked another road, and it did not affect the train schedules that Helen would have taken. At that moment, the woman began to seriously consider that something had happened to her daughter. Firstly, Helen almost always returned home from work on time. Secondly, she would always call home and inform them if she planned to stay out late. Although there were no mobile phones back then, Helen could have made a call from work or any telephone booth, which were found almost on every corner. The mother thought that Helen might have been in trouble due to the bad weather. For example, she might have fallen due to the heavy rain and wind and hurt herself. The woman and her son then started calling local hospitals in all nearby towns, but no one resembling Helen had been admitted. The mother also considered the possibility that her daughter might have stayed late at work and called the office, but they told her that Helen had left several hours ago. None of her friends knew where she was either. Afterwards, Helen's mother, stepfather, and boyfriend decided to go on a search. They walked along the road that Helen used to take home from work. Helen always took the same route, taking a train from Liverpool to the small town of St. Helens and then taking a bus to Billing. However, they were unable to find her, so the family decided to contact the police. They first notified officers in Liverpool and the surrounding areas, distributing descriptions of the missing young woman, but no one was able to find her. The next morning, when Helen had still not returned home or contacted anyone, the police decided to retrace her steps and reconstruct the timeline of events from the previous evening. They wanted to understand at what point along her journey from work to home she went missing. To do this, investigators appealed to the public for witnesses. They also spoke with Helen's colleagues, employees at the train station, and bus company. As a result, they came to an unexpected conclusion. They were able to confirm that on the night of her disappearance, she not only took a train, but also a bus to her village. This was strange because the bus stop was only 200 meters from her home. Detectives began to suspect that she might have been abducted because if it was an accident, she would have been discovered by now. As part of the standard procedure, detectives began to investigate people close to Helen, since in most cases, they are the ones behind such crimes. Her boyfriend and stepfather had reliable alibis for that evening, and Helen's friends and acquaintances were also excluded from the list of possible suspects. Forming search teams of 120 officers, the police began a detailed search of the area between the bus stop and Helen's house, hoping to find any clues, such as a piece of her clothing or something that the potential kidnapper might have dropped. At the same time, leaflets with information about the missing young woman were distributed in nearby towns. Divers searched local water bodies, and police officers knocked on every door, questioning people. They also went to all the shops, bars, and cafes in Billings. After talking to the staff at a bar called George and Dragon, they got their first lead. This establishment was located near Helen's house, and she occasionally went there with her friends. But investigators found out that just 2 days before her disappearance, the bar owner banned her from the bar after an incident. She had had a quarrel with a drunk woman who spilled her drink on her. Helen didn't want to provoke the conflict and went to the toilet to try to clean her clothes, but the drunken woman followed her and started acting aggressively. At some point, she even tried to hit her, after which the bar owner kicked them both out. Moreover, he forbade them from ever returning. The police decided to learn more about this conflict and went to the bar the next day to talk to its owner, Ian Simpson. Moreover, this establishment was located right between the bus stop and Helen's house. The man told detectives about that evening and said that he had to kick both young women out so that their conflict didn't disturb other visitors. During their conversation, the bar slowly filled with people and it became noisy. Then the police suggested that Ian ride with them to the station to continue the dialogue in a more peaceful environment. And here, something strange happened. The man noticeably became nervous, refused to go with them, and tried to end the conversation. All of this seemed suspicious to investigators. Why was Ian so afraid to go to the station? Perhaps he had something to do with Helen's disappearance, or he knew more than he said. They decided to keep an eye on him and found out that the man was known for his philandering. Despite being a married man with 2 children, Ian constantly flirted with other women, and all the villagers knew about it. The police also found out that he constantly paid attention to Helen when she came to the bar. The investigators once again approached him and asked where he was on the evening of Helen's disappearance. The man explained that he was spending time with his lover in an apartment located above a bar. According to him, he spent most of his time there because he was afraid that his establishment could be robbed. The detective spoke with his lover, and here they encountered an interesting twist. The woman claimed that she and Ian had indeed planned to meet at his apartment at around 7 p.m. However, that evening, he called her and asked her to come a few hours later. In the end, she arrived at around 8:30, but the man wasn't home. He returned only around 11:30. All of this looked extremely suspicious. Obviously, Ian lied to the police about his alibi, which automatically made him a suitable candidate for the role of suspect. One more detail seemed strange to the detectives. The man had several fresh scratches on his neck. He said he got them during a fight with his wife when she found out about his lover. However, the investigators spoke with the woman, and she denied scratching her husband. The police spoke with Ian again, and he changed his story. Now the man claimed that he got the scratches while separating Helen and another drunk young woman on the evening when a scuffle happened in the bar. The detective spoke with this young woman, but she denied this story. According to her, they didn't come to blows and none of them scratched the bar owner. Soon, the police got a witness who told them a worrying fact. On the evening of Helen's disappearance, he was passing through that street and at some point heard a piercing female scream. It was coming from the bar, but it quickly cut off. Based on all this, the detectives began to think that 31-year-old Ian Sims had a direct connection to the Helen's disappearance. However, he continued to deny everything. The investigators needed serious evidence to tie him to this case. Otherwise, they would be powerless. Police decided to search his car, where they found two gruesome pieces of evidence. Firstly, they found several bloodstains, and secondly, a part of a woman's earring was lying on the floor. They immediately took the earring to Helen's mother, who, without a doubt, confirmed that it belonged to her daughter. After that, Ian was arrested on charges of kidnapping and murder, even though the police still didn't know what had happened to Helen. They searched the bar and the apartment on the second floor, where they found new evidence. In both places, there were many barely noticeable bloodstains that had clearly been attempted to be washed away. On one of these spots, the criminalists found a fingerprint that belonged to Ian. Moreover, in the apartment, they found the missing part of the same earring that was previously discovered in his car. Despite such an impressive set of evidence, the man continued to deny everything. By this point, the police thought that Helen was dead. They needed to find her body. Otherwise, the court could justify Ian. They believed that the blood in his apartment and car belonged to the young woman. But in those years, DNA analysis was just beginning to be used in forensics, and organizing such research was very problematic. The man himself told the police that the blood belonged to his dog, which injured its paw. In an attempt to find more evidence, investigators decided to appeal to the public to organize more extensive searches. More than 2,000 people responded to their call, including both residents of the village and nearby settlements. Together with the police, they searched the area around Billing, including forests and fields. Soon, a new piece of evidence did appear in this case, but it was not discovered by volunteers. 25 kilometers from the village, in a place called Collins Green, a man walking his dog noticed a towel on the ground with traces of blood. He looked around and saw another such towel, as well as several pillowcases. In addition, he found men's socks, a sweater, and underwear nearby. Some of these items were also covered in blood. He reported his findings to the police, and they took the items to a storage facility for evidence. But here was one problem. Considering that this area was 25 kilometers from Billing, police officers from another department arrived at the call, and they did not connect this find with Helen McCord's case. And the investigators who were searching for her didn't even know about the discovery of the bloody items. In the end, the police eventually saw a connection between the cases, and the inscription on the found sweater helped them. It was a print with an advertisement for a beer brand that was being sold on promotion at the George and Dragon Bar at the time. Learning this, investigators concluded that all of these things, with a high degree of probability, belonged to Ian Sims. Thus, the detectives had numerous blood samples, but they did not have Helen's body to request a DNA analysis. It was 1988, and such tools were not yet widely used. The police decided to compare the blood samples from the bar, Ian's car, and the witnesses found items with the blood of Helen's closest relatives, her parents and younger brother. The results showed that these samples were very close, and the blood almost certainly belonged to close relatives. Thus, the detectives were convinced that the blood samples belonged to Helen. This unequivocally indicated that Ian was clearly involved in her disappearance, but they still needed more evidence. The problem was that the expression, "no body, no case," did not appear out of nowhere. the British court rarely passed guilty verdicts in murder cases if the victim's body was not found. No matter how weighty the evidence may have seemed in the eyes of justice, there was always a slight chance that the victim might not be dead. The police hoped that they would be able to gather more information against Ian, so they questioned all of his acquaintances. After talking to the bar cleaner, they learned about another suspicious incident. The woman told them that on the morning after Helen's disappearance, she came to work as usual to clean the premises. To her surprise, she saw the owner himself doing a general cleaning. He was washing the floors, walls, and tables. Moreover, judging by the scale of the work, he had been doing it for more than an hour. The problem was that this had never happened before. Ian had never participated in cleaning his bar, and in general, he rarely got up so early. Usually, when the cleaner came for her morning shift, the man was still sleeping in his apartment upstairs. When she asked him why he had suddenly decided to clean the entire premises himself, Ian replied that his dog had made a mess. Another witness told the police that he had passed by this bar at night and heard the sound of a working vacuum cleaner from inside. The police concluded that Ian had been trying to get rid of the bloodstains all night, but he had not been able to completely complete the task. Despite all this, even with the suspicion surrounding Ian, they still needed more evidence. Investigators tried to find the young woman's body, but even extensive searches yielded no results. A month later, another piece of evidence fell into their hands. A man was walking along the river, about 30 kilometers from Billings, and noticed a woman's purse in the grass. Looking inside, he found documents in the name of Helen McCord. The police arrived at the scene, and soon they found even more evidence. Nearby, they discovered the clothing the young woman was wearing on the day of her disappearance, as well as a second earring identical to the one found in Ian's car. But a more horrific discovery awaited the detectives. A coiled cable was lying near the clothes, tangled with female hair. They were sent to the laboratory, and soon the experts confirmed that the hair belonged to Helen McCord. Examining the young woman's purse, investigators found a check from a pharmacy in St. Helens. It turned out that she went there shopping on the evening of her disappearance, just before taking the bus to Billings. The police found all the items purchased at the pharmacy near the purse, except for one, a toothbrush. But soon they found it too, not 30 kilometers from the village next to the purse, but in the same bar as Ian Simpson, where investigators were still conducting extensive searches. They also managed to find a hairpin, and Helen's mother confirmed that the young woman went to work with her that morning. But that was not all. In the bar, they found a clump of female hair that belonged to Helen, confirmed by DNA analysis. Despite all of this, the detectives continued to cling to every detail and handed over the woman's clothing to the laboratory. After a thorough examination, forensic experts found traces of carpet on it, identical to the one in the George and Dragon bar. In addition, they found traces of dog hair on the clothing, which matched the hair of Ian's dog. After that, the experts began to study 2 rings and a bracelet that were seized from the man after his arrest. Forensic experts found traces of dirt on them and compared them with the soil in the area where bloody towels and Ian's clothing were found. As surprising as it may sound, they were able to prove that the dirt was from that region, which once again confirmed that the man was there and had himself thrown away these things. Soon after this, the police found another piece of evidence. Near the town of Rixton, located 24 kilometers from Billings, they found a shovel. They were able to determine that the shovel belonged to Ian Simpson, and apparently he used it to bury Helen's body. However, they still couldn't find the body itself, despite the constant work of hundreds of volunteers. The young woman's relatives were almost 100% sure that she was dead. With such a colossal set of evidence, waiting for a miracle was simply pointless. Yet they couldn't finally confirm this and give her a decent burial, as well as be sure that the perpetrator would be punished. Ian continued to insist that he had nothing to do with the murder, and eventually, the police handed the case over to the court. The trial began a year after Helen's disappearance in February 1989. This was one of the first cases in Britain where a person was tried for murder in the absence of the victim's body. Therefore, despite the huge amount of evidence, the prosecution doubted their victory. According to their version, that evening Helen got off the bus and headed home along her usual route. When she passed by the George and Dragon Bar, Ian Simpson noticed her and started talking to her on some pretext. Perhaps the man was trying to discuss with her the incident that led to him banning her from his establishment. Then he must have lured her inside somehow. According to the investigation, Ian could have offered to resolve the conflict and lift the ban on her visiting the bar. Considering that this was practically the only place in Billings where Helen could go with her friends, she was interested in resolving the conflict. Apparently, the man lured her inside the building where there was no one else at the time. Almost immediately after that, he attacked her, which was confirmed by the testimony of a passing witness. He heard a female scream that was quickly cut off. Attacking Helen, Ian killed her with an electric cable and dragged her into his second-floor apartment. There, he possibly subjected the young woman to violence, after which he waited for darkness and loaded the body into his car. The man drove her away from Billing and buried her, after which he scattered her things, his clothes, and other items in other remote places. There were several versions regarding his motives. The first one was forced. From the testimony of many witnesses, the investigation knew that Ian had repeatedly shown signs of attention to the young woman, but she always refused him. Probably that evening, he saw an opportunity to fulfill his criminal desires. The second version was that during their conversation, some conflict arose between them and he killed her in a fit of rage. It is possible that he and Helen began to argue, and she threatened to tell his wife about his constant harassment. However, this theory looked less realistic. After the prosecution spoke in court, it was Ian's turn. He still claimed that he was completely innocent and told his version, and it was one of the strangest speeches ever made by a man accused of murder. The man claimed that someone framed him. Someone else sneaked into the bar, put on his clothes, lured Helen there, and killed her. After that, he put her body in Ian's car and buried it with Ian's shovel in an unknown place. After all of this, the killer drove the car back to the bar and disappeared, framing the innocent bar owner. After such statements, the jurors became even more convinced that Ian was directly involved in the murder. His story sounded completely absurd. Perhaps he already understood that he would most likely go to prison and decided to make fun of the justice system and the victim's relatives. As a result, on March 14, 1989, the man was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment with the right to apply for parole no earlier than 16 years in prison. Unfortunately, for Helen's family, it was far from the end. The police and volunteers continued to search for her body, but without success. 3 years after the sentencing, the young woman's mother wrote a letter to the killer, desperately pleading to reveal the location of her daughter's body. After some time, Ian replied, but his letter contained only insults and threats. He promised to take revenge on the woman as soon as he was released from prison. The killer repeatedly appealed, but all his appeals were rejected. Only in 2004, when he had already spent 15 years behind bars, one of the appeals was granted, and the case was sent for review. However, it did not play in the killer's favor. With the help of modern DNA analysis tools, experts examined the evidence and concluded that all of them unequivocally proved Ian's guilt. As a result, the case review essentially led to an increase in the prison sentence. After 16 years, the criminal repeatedly applied for release, but all his applications were rejected. Meanwhile, Helen's family continued to fight to find her body. In 2015, her mother launched a public campaign seeking to change existing laws. She demanded that convicted murderers be denied early release until they disclosed the location of their victim's body. The woman gave interviews to various channels, wrote letters to Prime Minister Theresa May, and also created a petition that gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures. As a result, this issue was brought to Parliament for consideration, and initially, politicians positively assessed the possibility of passing such a law. However, time passed, and Helen's mother initiative was constantly delayed. All these delays led to the fact that in November 2019, after 30 years of imprisonment, Ian Sims finally achieved early release. This event was a heavy blow to the young woman's family, as they had practically lost any hope of finding the location of her remains. 3 months after the decision was made, the killer was released. 63-year-old Ian Sims returned to a normal life. However, he did not enjoy his freedom for long. In late June 2022, the man died from an illness, taking the secret of Helen's body's location with him to the grave. Helen's mother is still alive and does not plan to give up. She now hopes that Ian may have told someone among his cellmates where he hid the body. She also continues to fight for the adoption of a law that would prohibit the early release of murderers who refuse to disclose the location of their victim. Thus, the Helen McCourt case lasted for several decades, although it was solved in a matter of days. Despite the overwhelming evidence against the criminal, he continued to keep secret information that would have allowed the relatives of his victim to say goodbye to her and start to heal their wounds. Alice Ruggles was born on December 24, 1991, exactly one day before Christmas. Her parents, Sue Hills and Clive Ruggles, already had 2 children, and later another boy was born in the family. They lived in the tiny English village of Torlangton, located in Lancashire County. The family was very close-knit, and the older children always took care of Alice and her younger brother. In the local school, the girl started attending a drama club and quickly fell in love with acting. She participated in many theatrical productions, and all her teachers noted her natural talent. After graduating from high school, at the age of 18, Alice enrolled in Northumbria University, where she studied design. After receiving her diploma in 2014, she moved to a city called Gateshead and got a job at the major British media company Sky. Alice rented an apartment with her roommates because it was difficult for her to afford separate housing at first. In October 2015, when the young woman was 23, she met a man named Harry Dillon. He stumbled upon her account on Facebook through a mutual friends page. They started talking and soon became fond of each other. Harry was from India and came to Great Britain through a student program. He transferred from a local Indian university to Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh. After completing his studies, he decided to stay in England and join the army. After some time, he was sent to Afghanistan, where he started communicating with Alice on Facebook. At first, they just exchanged messages, then began calling each other several times a week, and eventually started a relationship. They eagerly awaited the moment when Harry would return to Great Britain to finally meet. When it happened, they went on several dates, and Harry made a good impression on Alice. They had a great time, and the mutual attraction between them only grew stronger. However, after a few weeks, they had to separate again. Harry had to go back to Afghanistan for 2 more months, after which they planned to continue their relationship. The couple continued to communicate online until Harry finally returned to England in April. He lived in a military base in Edinburgh, which was almost 200 kilometers away from the city, where Alice lived, but Harry tried to visit her whenever he could. Months after Harry's return to England, Alice invited him to a family celebration, and it seemed like their relationship was getting stronger. But over time, acquaintances began to notice significant changes in her behavior. Previously, she was always cheerful, sociable, and positive, but something was changing in her every day. Alice became withdrawn, depressed, and stopped spending time with friends. She even stopped communicating with them in social media, and no one could understand what was happening to her. Alice became more irritable, and at one point, she had a fight with her apartment neighbors. She packed her things and moved to her colleague's apartment. Alice's family and friends began to suspect that her new boyfriend Harry was the cause of these significant changes. At first, she was reluctant to share her relationship problems, but it became impossible to hide them over time. It turned out that Harry was not the kind and caring man he was in the first months after they met. The longer their relationship lasted, the more he tried to control every aspect of Alice's life. Harry was against her hanging out with friends or talking to other men, even if they were her old acquaintances or work colleagues. He began to monitor her social media conversations and constantly accused her of wanting to cheat on him. Every time she talked to friends or planned to go out with them, Harry would throw a tantrum. But what was even more interesting, Harry began openly cheating on Alice, meeting women from Tinder for one-night stands without any commitment. After that, he often talked about these women to Alice to make her jealous. It even got to the point where one of these women wrote to Alice on social media in August. At that moment, the young woman decided to break up with Harry, but he didn't want to let her go. He bombarded Alice with messages and calls, trying to get her back by any means necessary. At first, he said that he loved her, cried on the phone, and promised to change for the better. Then he began openly manipulating the young woman, promising to take his own life and blaming her for everything. It even got to direct threats. It turned out that Harry had secretly taken pictures of Alice while she was changing clothes, and he threatened to post these pictures on the internet if she didn't come back to him. In the end, Alice decided to simply ignore him. And then Harry changed tactics. He started calling her friends and relatives, asking them to reason with the young woman. Realizing that this also didn't work, he began writing her letters with poems about his love for her. However, soon he once again resorted to threats and blackmail. But Alice still didn't respond to these letters. Later, it turned out that Harry had managed to hack her Facebook account and was monitoring her correspondence. From there, he found out that since September, Alice had started communicating with a man named Mike, who was an army officer and was in another country at the time. Harry was furious. He began writing to Mike that Alice was still in love with him and sleeping with him, and also wrote various nasty things about her. But by that time, Mike already knew about Harry and didn't pay any attention to his words. He continued his relationship with Alice, and it seemed that the young woman had managed to get out of this whole situation with Harry. She became sociable, cheerful, and happy again. But unfortunately, this didn't last long. On September 30th, Harry left her a voice message begging her to pick up the phone. Alice ignored him, and then he decided to go to her house. The man drove 2.5 hours from his military base to her apartment, but then he behaved quite strangely. First, he rang the doorbell and ran away. Alice was at home, but she didn't open the door because she didn't see anyone through the peephole. The situation repeated several times. Then, a few hours later, Harry climbed over the fence and approached the window of her bedroom. Alice lived on the first floor of a 2-story house with a fenced area. Harry knocked on the window and hid, leaving a box of candy and a bouquet on the windowsill. What happened greatly frightened Alice. She immediately understood that Harry was behind all of it. Additionally, when she approached the window, she briefly saw a man hiding outside her field of view. But that wasn't all. While hiding in her yard, Harry recorded several creepy voice messages, the content of which caused Alice real panic. One of them began with the words, "You said guys like me end up killing people." After these words, he began repeating multiple times that he didn't want to kill her. From his voice, Alice felt like he was primarily trying to convince himself of what he said. Finally, he wished her good night and left. All of this was already enough for Alice to contact the police. After what happened, she began to seriously fear for her life and didn't know how else to protect herself from Harry. The operator offered her two options for solving the problem. She could obtain a restraining order against Harry or ask the police to issue an official police information notice, known in Great Britain as a PIN. It allowed the police to arrest the man if he approached or contacted Alice. The young woman chose the latter option. The next day, the police came to her, took a statement, and assured her that Harry would face the consequences if he bothered her again. After some time, the police called the military unit and informed the commanding officer about the measures taken against Harry. Interestingly, the police did not contact him personally, even by phone, let alone a personal visit, although they were obliged to do so by law. Learning that Alice had contacted the police, he became angry and wrote her another letter, along with a box of items that reminded him of her. In the letter, he said that because of her complaint, his phone, tablet, and laptop were taken away from him. He also promised not to bother her again. But Alice knew for sure he wouldn't just calm down like that. When she first contacted the police, they told her to call them immediately if Harry contacted her again, so she did. She told the operator about the letter and the box of items, but he didn't know what action to take in this case. Moreover, he asked Alice herself what actions she expected from them. In the end, he promised her that another officer would call her back. Of course, this response from the police shocked Alice, and she had no idea what to do next. Several hours later, an officer did call her back and listened to her entire story. He then asked if she wanted the police to arrest Harry, and here Alice made a fatal mistake. She felt sorry for him and answered negatively. However, even if he had been arrested, Harry would not have received any punishment. He would have been held for some time in the station and released. After this, Alice realized that the police could not help her in the situation that had arisen, so she was left to rely only on herself. On October 12th, 5 days after she went to the police, Alice remained depressed and frightened. She hoped to distract herself from these troubling thoughts over the weekend. Mike was supposed to come see her, and they planned to spend the next few days together. That evening, Alice returned home from work, and her neighbor was not home. She began to prepare for bed while chatting with Mike about their upcoming meeting, but she did not know that Harry had been standing in the courtyard of her building and watching her. Taking advantage of the fact that Alice had left the window slightly open, he climbed into her bedroom and went to the kitchen, where he took a knife and went to the bathroom where Alice was. The events that followed unfolded rapidly. Harry struck her 24 times with the knife, causing Alice to die almost instantly. After that, he left the apartment, got into his car, and drove back to his military unit. In less than an hour, Alice's neighbor returned home and found that the front door was locked from the inside. She knocked several times, hoping Alice would answer, but she did not. Then the neighbor went to the backyard to knock on the window of Alice's bedroom, but what she saw shocked her. Through the open window, she saw Alice laying on the bathroom floor in a pool of blood. She immediately called the police in a panic and told them what had happened, adding, "We knew this was going to happen. Her ex is a real psychopath." Less than 2 minutes later, the neighbor heard police sirens approaching. and with them came paramedics who confirmed Alice's death. It became immediately obvious to them that the conversation was about a murder, in connection with the fact that the neighbor named Harry Dillon as a potential killer. The police immediately began to search for him. After running the numbers of his car, they found that the man had driven from Edinburgh to Newcastle that day. His car appeared on several surveillance cameras. Just a few hours later, the police arrived at the military base and arrested Harry. They took him to the station and began to interrogate him. The man admitted that he had gone to see Alice, but denied any involvement in the murder. According to him, he came to talk to her, and she allegedly came out onto the street and hit him in the face during the conversation. After that, Harry allegedly got into his car and drove back to the base, but detectives quickly found out that his story had nothing to do with reality. From the surveillance cameras, they learned that Harry had arrived at Alice's house even before she returned from work. He parked his car and waited. But that's not all. Investigators examined his phone and found that while Harry was sitting in the car, he was messaging with a random girl on Tinder and arranging to meet her that same night. Detectives also found bloodstains on the steering wheel of Harry's car, and analysis showed that this blood belonged to Alice. Moreover, the man stole her phone and took it with him, which is why the geolocation of the device completely matched the movements of the killer that day. All of this was enough to bring charges of murder and send the case to court. However, the first hearing took place only almost a year later, in April 2017. Harry's lawyers realized that with such a set of evidence against their client, they needed to come up with a new story. As a result, the man claimed that he had actually come to Alice's house to collect his things, but they had an argument, and then Alice allegedly took a knife and attacked him, accidentally inflicting 24 wounds on herself. After that, he watched her die and even heard her last words. She allegedly said that she hated her family. Of course, this delusional story was not taken seriously. Moreover, during the court hearings, another gruesome fact emerged. Before the murder, Harry had visited Alice's house several times, sneaked into the backyard, and took pictures. According to the prosecution, he carefully planned the murder in advance. 11 days later, the court handed down a guilty verdict: life imprisonment with the possibility of applying for parole in 22 years. During a reading of the verdict, the judge noted that Harry showed no remorse or compassion. Instead, he was focused only on inventing the most plausible story. Another horrific detail from Harry's past came to light during the trial. 3 years before these events, his ex-girlfriend obtained a restraining order against him because he was stalking her in the same way he would later stalk Alice, but the police simply did not know about it. After the murder, society and the media harshly criticized the police, accusing them of failing to protect Alice from a dangerous psychopath, letting the case go unchecked. Later, 2 officers were disciplined. The army also came under fire. The public was outraged that such an unbalanced and dangerous person was allowed to join. In addition, no action was taken against Harry when the PIN was issued against him. Sometime later, Alice's family launched a foundation named in her honor. Its goal was to work towards ensuring the victims of stalking receive immediate and proper assistance from the police. Alice's case showed that law enforcement agencies simply cannot provide such protection, so legislative changes are needed. In 2019, a law was passed that simplifies the issuance of restraining orders against people who stalk their victims. However, Alice's family continues to work on the foundation and hopes that it will help change the situation in the country for the better. Now, all her relatives and acquaintances believe that this tragedy could have been avoided if the police had taken their duties more seriously. Sally Ann Bowman was born on September 11, 1987 in London. She grew up in a large family with 3 older sisters. Her parents, Linda and Paul, later divorced, but the girl continued to maintain a good relationship with her father. Sally was a cheerful and friendly girl with a big heart. At the same time, she was also very responsible. Already in her teens, she got a job and came to live in rented housing. The girl did not want to depend on her parents financially, but continued to see her family regularly. Later, Sally enrolled at the prestigious London School of Performing Arts and Technology, BRIT. This institution is known for such alumni as actor Tom Holland, Adele, and Amy Winehouse. Sally dreamed of working as a model, and the fact that she was able to enroll at this school was a big step towards her cherished goal. Graduating in 2004, she spent some time working as a hairstylist and model. But in January 2005, she landed a job with a London-based model agency, Pulse Model Management. From the first months, Sally has achieved impressive success in the new work. She became the face of the popular watch brand Swatch and took part in prestigious fashion shows. As a result, by the age of 18, she had already managed to build a successful career. On Saturday, September 24, 2005, Sally went to visit her mother and spent most of the day at her home. Later, her older sister, Nicole, called her and invited her to her best friend's birthday party. Sally agreed and left her mother's house around 6 p.m. At the end, she said she loved her. At 10 p.m., the young woman met her sister and her friends at the Lloyd's Bar establishment in downtown Croydon. Surveillance footage at the bar showed Sally having a great time. The company was partying, socializing, and dancing. At about 1 a.m., Sally left the bar with her sister. They walked to her house, but the young woman didn't stay there long. On the way, she called her ex-boyfriend, Louis Sportster, and arranged to meet him in downtown Croydon. At about 2:30 a.m., she got in a cab and drove to the designated location. During the meeting, there was an argument between them. They had broken up only a few weeks earlier over mutual grievances and have been trying unsuccessfully to resolve the situation ever since. Louis decided to give her a ride home on Blenheim Crescent, and they continued to argue the entire way. The couple worked out the relationship until about 4:15 a.m., at which point Sally got out of the car and headed home. At about the same time, neighbors were awakened by an unexplained noise that changed to screaming. People ran to the windows, but there was nothing suspicious going on outside. 5 minutes later, they only saw an unknown man walking down the street. At about 6:30 a.m., one of the neighbors came out of the house and noticed something strange. From behind a nearby construction container, looked out something that he first mistook for the legs of a mannequin. But as soon as he came closer, a frightening sight awaited him. There lay the half-naked body of a dead woman. She turned out to be Sally Bowman. The police quickly arrived on the scene and sealed off the area. They were unable to find the murder weapon, but experts later found DNA on the woman's body from an unknown man. They also discovered that Sally had been stabbed at least 7 times with a sharp object and had been abused. The unknown maniac had even left several bite marks on her body. Sally's family was shattered by this news. When her mother heard a knock on the door this morning, she thought it was Sally coming home. But there were police officers on the doorstep who informed her of her daughter's murder. Hours later, Sally's mother and sister had to go to the morgue to be identified. They hoped to the last that it was all one big mistake and that Sally was really alive. It wasn't until they saw her body that they realized it was really her. Meanwhile, the police launched an investigation, and the first thing they did was run a DNA sample from the woman's body through the databases. But that didn't help them identify the perpetrator. There was also no cameras in that area, which only made the job more difficult. Investigators determined that Sally was killed just 10 feet from the door of her home. Her path from her car to the building was also very short. Her attacker must have attacked her almost immediately after she left the car. The first thing the police suspected was her ex-boyfriend, Louis. He was the last person to see Sally, and her murder occurred almost immediately after she got out of the car. Investigators also found out that the couple had often quarreled in the past. Several times it even went as far as calling the police, but no charges were ever filed. On the same day, the police tracked him down and arrested him. When questioned, he stated that he didn't even know Sally was dead until the detectives themselves told him about it. He admitted that there had indeed been an altercation between them that night, but denied any involvement in the murder. According to his version, as soon as Sally got out of the car, he drove away. The investigators were in no hurry to take the guy's word for it, because things looked really not in his favor. He spent 4 days in custody while detectives waited for the results of a DNA test. Eventually, it was discovered that his DNA did not match the sample, and Lewis was released. At the same time, experts discovered another interesting detail. The DNA sample found on Sally's body appeared in a criminal case 4 years ago. In 2001, a woman called from a phone booth located in the parking lot of a convenience store. At some point, a man entered the booth, stripped naked, and committed lewd acts. He did not touch the woman and fled, but left his DNA on the floor of the booth. The victim went to the police, and a sample of the pervert's DNA was attached to the case. However, they were never able to find the perpetrator. All of this happened not too far from where Sally was killed, 2.5 kilometers away. The police realized that they were dealing with a serial pervert who had been on the loose for years. The only question was how many women had suffered at the hands of this maniac and when he would strike next. Detectives had to find him before he ruined someone else's life. It soon became clear that the police's fears were not in vain. Just an hour before Sally's murder, a woman had been attacked on a nearby street. She was walking home, talking on her cell phone. At some point, a man approached her, apologized, and immediately struck her. The woman screamed and dropped her phone, but what happened next was something the attacker clearly did not expect. A taxicab appeared on the road, and that frightened him away. He grabbed the victim's phone and fled. One creepy thing worth noting here: the person on the other end of the line, the woman was still on the line and heard everything. Even after the perpetrator took the phone and disappeared from the victim's sight, her cries for help did not become any quieter. That meant he was hiding quiet nearby. Perhaps he hoped that the cab driver would drive by and the victim would be at his disposal again. Fortunately, the driver heard the screams and stopped. He put the woman in the car and took her to the hospital. There, she called the police and told them what had happened. According to her description, the attacker was a white male, 25 to 30 years old, about 180 centimeters tall, with short, dark hair. On the basis of this data, the police compiled a sketch, which was published in the media. Alas, a large number of men fell under such a vague description, so detectives received hundreds of calls from local residents. They all said that the sketch looked like someone they knew or had seen a similar man somewhere. Each such call was checked by the police, but it yielded no results. When they realized they would not be able to find the maniac from the sketch, the investigators decided to go another way. The only lead they had was a DNA sample found on the victim's body. In addition, the detectives were sure that the perpetrator lived in the area. This was evidenced by the fact that he had also attacked a woman in a phone booth on a nearby street. As a result, the decision was made to DNA screen the entire neighborhood. Police officers were to go to every apartment and house, ask questions, and ask residents to volunteer their DNA samples. Of course, the detectives did not expect the perpetrator to give them his DNA, but it was enough to get a sample from his relatives to get them closer to catching the culprit. For example, the man may have lived with parents who are unaware of his atrocities and would willingly provide his DNA to the police. For the next 6 months, police officers went to more than 6,000 addresses, and many area residents provided their DNA samples. But the entire operation came to nothing. Despite law enforcement's efforts, experts at the lab found no matches with the perpetrator's sample. All the while, the people of Croydon were in fear, and police rounds only increased the anxiety. They all knew there was a maniac on their streets. Women were afraid to walk at night. Parents would not let their children go out. As a result, the police had to go back to the sketch since there was nothing else to work with. They contacted the woman who had been attacked by the maniac on the day of Sally's murder, as well as the victim from the phone booth. They were asked to re-describe the perpetrator's appearance, and based on this testimony, the detectives compiled an adjusted version of the sketch. The police showed it at a press conference and, for the first time, revealed some details of the crimes committed, which up to that point had been kept secret. This was done in the expectation that the citizens of Croydon would realize how dangerous maniacs walk freely on their streets and would be more careful. Alas, all this also yielded no results. The updated sketch was not much different from the previous one and was too generalized. Thousands of men who lived in the area fit it. But what happened next was something no one expected. A completely random breakthrough in the case. A man was sitting in a bar watching soccer, and after drinking heavily, he began to argue with one of the patrons, and soon their conflict turned into a scuffle on the street. Unfortunately for him, a police officer walked by as he pushed his opponent to the ground. He apprehended the attacker and took him to the police station. There, something strange began. The instigator of the conflict, Mark Dixie, 35, went into a real panic and almost cried. This was very illogical behavior since he had been arrested for a misdemeanor. Most likely, no charges would have been filed by his opponent at all, and the man was free to go home. The police found him very suspicious, but they soon had to release him on bail. Before that, they conducted the standard procedure for all detainees, taking his fingerprints and a DNA sample. 12 days passed, and the detectives received a call from the lab. The experts made an unexpected announcement. Mark Dixie's DNA was a perfect match to the sample found on Sally's body. Investigators realized they had a dangerous maniac on their hands, but they let him go. In any case, the law would not allow them to hold him any longer, and now the police had to re-arrest the perpetrator. Unfortunately for them, Dixie escaped to Amsterdam as soon as he was released. The British authorities put out a search warrant for him, but the man successfully escaped. This went on for 3 months until something strange happened. The criminal quarreled with the owner of the apartment he was renting in Amsterdam and returned back to England. Moreover, he got a job at his previous place of work, making the work of the police much easier. On June 28, 2006, almost a year after the murder, he was finally arrested and this time charged with a whole series of serious crimes. After examining his background, police found that Mark had a very rich criminal history. He committed his first crime in 1986 when he was 16 years old. He attacked a woman with a knife, robbed her, and committed depraved acts. He was sentenced to only 6 months in prison because of his age. Each subsequent year, Mark was put on trial again for robbery and molestation. And in 1990, he was arrested for assaulting a police officer. Unfortunately, all of these times the court system was favorable to him. The man received little time and continued to commit crimes. In 1993, he moved to Australia, where he picked up where he left off. 5 years later, he broke into a young woman's home, robbed and abused her. He was then arrested for exhibitionism in a park and deported from the country in 1999. Unfortunately, in those years, the police were not yet collecting DNA samples from criminals, so Dixie's DNA from the murdered woman's body showed no matches in existing databases. The police had a lot of work to do before taking the case to court. They discovered that the night Sally was killed, Dixie was celebrating his birthday at a bar with friends on Brighton Road, a few hundred yards from her home. He argued with his girlfriend over the phone and spent the rest of the evening abusing alcohol and illegal substances. He withdrew into himself and had little contact with anyone. After the bar closed, Mark and his 2 girlfriends went to a house nearby. Waiting for them to fall asleep, the man took a knife and went outside. According to the investigation, he was the one who attacked the woman who was saved from death by a cab driver. Fearing that she would call the police, Mark left for another street. Unfortunately, that's when Sally Bowman got out of the car and headed for her door. He attacked her, abused her, and fled. Apparently, it was him walking down the street that the neighbors saw from their windows at night. After killing Sally, he went back to his apartment and quietly went to bed. Mark Dixie's trial began on February 5, 2008. He refused to admit his guilt, instead making up a really ridiculous story. According to his version, he was just walking down the street and saw Sally laying on the ground. He took advantage of the situation, abused her and left, and someone else killed the woman. Dixie claimed that he allegedly did not know the woman was dead. During the trial, a woman from Australia was also found who Dixie attacked in 1998. He abused her, stabbing her 7 times, but never punished her. The jury unanimously found Dixie guilty of Sally's murder, despite his ridiculous history. As a result, the court sentenced him to life in prison with a minimum sentence of 34 years. After that, he was transferred from one prison to another several times, as each time his cellmates bullied him and tried to kill him. All this time, Mark continued to deny his involvement in the murder, and it wasn't until 2015, 10 years later, that he confessed. This did not make his situation any worse, but the police were able to prove his involvement in the other crimes. In 2017, it turned out that an innocent Dutch citizen had served 12 years in prison for an attack on 3 women in Spain, which was in fact committed by Mark Dixie. In addition, the perpetrator also voluntarily confessed to another assault, which he committed when he was 16 years old. Dixie attacked a woman in a parking lot, abused her, stole her credit cards, and set her car on fire. That same evening, he found out her home phone number, called her, and began taunting the victim. The woman then moved to live in the countryside because she could not cope with her trauma. That same year, Dixie was found guilty of assaulting 2 women in Croydon, for each of which he received another life sentence. 2017 was marked by another unpleasant event. Sally's family had to exhume her remains because unknown vandals kept desecrating her grave. The family decided to cremate her and leave her ashes at home. After all of this ordeal, Sally's mother is a strong advocate for a national DNA database. In her opinion, if the government collected DNA samples of all British residents, such crimes would be solved in 24 hours instead of 9 months. In addition, the woman was certain that if the perpetrator had not left his DNA at the scene, Sally's ex-boyfriend would have gone to prison for life for a murder he did not commit. The detective leading the investigation in Sally's murder supported the idea of a DNA database, but the government rejected it. In their view, forced DNA collection would violate basic human rights. This issue is very controversial. On one hand, such a database would really help solve such crimes in a matter of hours. In addition, some criminals would not dare to commit atrocities at all, knowing that they could be identified very quickly. On the other hand, not every criminal leaves their DNA behind. Also, leaking or misusing information from such a database could really hurt law-abiding people. Fawn Cox was born March 24, 1973, in Kansas City, Missouri. Her parents soon had 2 more daughters. The family lived in a small 2-story house located in a rough residential neighborhood. From an early age, she helped her parents take care of the younger children, went to church regularly, and enjoyed swimming. When she turned 16, Fawn got a part-time job at a local amusement park. Her family lived quite poor, and the girl sought to earn at least some money in her spare time from school. She spent most of the summer vacations of 1989 at work. Mostly the girl stood behind the cash register and sold tickets to amusement rides. On Wednesday, July 26, she finished her shift at about 10 p.m. Her mother and younger sister picked her up in the car, as it would have taken a long time to get from the park to her home on public transportation. Almost immediately after returning home, Fawn went to bed, since she had to go to work again the next morning. The girl slept on the second floor. She had her own room. Her sisters usually slept in the next room, but that night she was alone on the floor. Her sister Amber, who was only a year younger, was babysitting for a familiar family that night. The other sister, Felicia, decided to sleep on the first floor because it was much cooler there. It was a very hot night, and the only air conditioner working was downstairs, and their parents also slept on the first floor. The next morning at about 9 o'clock, the whole family woke up to the sound of the alarm clock in Fawn's room, but the girl wouldn't turn it off for some reason. Then her younger sister and mother went up to her room, where a horrible sight awaited them. Fawn lay on the bed with no sign of life, her neck visibly bruised. The girl also had no pulse, and her parents immediately called an ambulance, but they were no longer able to help her. It was apparent that Fawn had passed away hours before. After examining her body, medical experts determined that strangulation was the cause of death, and the girl had also been abused. From the first hours, the police realized they had a very difficult investigation ahead of them. Despite the fact that Fawn was killed right in her room in a small house with very poor soundproofing, her parents and sister heard absolutely nothing. However, there was an explanation. The air conditioner on the first floor was old and very loud, blocking out any other noise in the house. The only strange thing that night was noticed by Fawn's sister. Their poodle was behaving anxiously and barking, but they did not pay much attention to it. This behavior was attributed to the fact that the dog was pregnant. After examining the scene, the police made several important discoveries. Their theory was that the attacker, or group, had entered the house through a second-story window overlooking the backyard. There was an old trailer parked near the house that could easily be used to climb up to the canopy of the outbuilding, which was almost level with the window. The window itself had been left open because there was no air conditioning on the second floor, and one had to fight the heat somehow. In Fawn's room, the experts found the first important clues: a few short hairs, small blood stains, and traces of semen on the sheet from her bed. All of this was sent to the lab for analysis. In addition, several items were missing from the house, including radios, a Nintendo game console, and a stereo recorder. Several other items were found on the ground in front of the house. It looked as if the burglar had thrown them out the window to take them with him, but left them there for some reason. Detectives also found that various items had been removed from a closet in an adjoining room on the second floor. They believed the perpetrator was hiding in that closet while waiting for everyone in the house to go to sleep. Normally, Fawn's sister slept in that room, but not that night. For this reason, no one noticed the items on display. The police discovered another strange clue. An old army cap was found in Fawn's room. All her relatives said they had never seen the girl wearing it. So detectives assumed the killer might have forgotten the cap at the scene. Despite the impressive array of evidence, police were unable to quickly identify the suspects. The problem is that in 1989, DNA forensics was rather underdeveloped, and there were no common genetic databases at that time. Detective Benjamin Caldwell, who handled the case, put forward the main version of what happened. In his opinion, there could have been several assailants, and they must have known the house well. Not only did they know how to get to the second floor through the backyard in total darkness, but they must also have known the layout of the rooms. The next step for the police was to look for witnesses. They interviewed neighbors, friends, and relatives of Fawn, but all were inconclusive. The detectives had one weighty problem before them. The neighborhood in which the house was located was very poor and criminal. Various criminal gangs operated there, and their participants were quite difficult to bring to justice. A month after Fawn's murder, the case finally got off the ground. The police had a witness who pointed them to 3 suspects. This witness knew a number of important details that the police never divulged, so his story was taken seriously. The suspects were 3 teenagers, one of whom was in the same class as Fawn. They were arrested and questioned, but the boys denied any involvement in the murder. During a search of one of their homes, police found items stolen from the victim's room. This was enough to charge all 3 of them with murder, but even here the detectives were disappointed. First, the witness suddenly recanted and stopped cooperating with the police. Second, DNA analysis of blood, hair, and semen found at the crime scene did not show an unambiguous match with the suspect's samples. In those years, experts could not yet establish an exact match of the samples, and all their tests showed questionable results. In other words, the analysis could not confirm either a full match or a guaranteed mismatch. Despite this, the police were able to obtain useful information from one of the detainees. During one of the interrogations, he confessed that he had indeed broken into Fawn's house that night in the company of other boys and stolen some things. He painted how he made his way to the second floor through the canopy of the canopy and even revealed unknown details. According to him, when he threw a tape recorder out the window, its handle fell off. The boy hid it under a nearby bush, and the police did find the item in that very spot. Except that the young man quickly retracted his statement and no longer cooperated with the investigation, which would have prevented his confession from being used in court. Because of this, the police had to let the men go, and the investigation was at a standstill again. Most likely, the witnesses were simply intimidated, but without their testimony in court, the case had almost no chance. All we know is that one of them spent 8 months in jail for stealing items from Fawn's house. The case has since gone into a long drawer. The police didn't reopen the investigation until the early 2000s, and the first thing they did was upload DNA samples from the crime scene to the CODIS database. It had been created several years before and contained DNA samples from people tried for serious crimes. Unfortunately, no matches were found for the Fawn killer. The emergence of this database was the result of major scientific advances in the study of DNA. It also allowed police to recollect DNA samples from the 3 original suspects and conduct more advanced tests. This time, experts unequivocally determined that the hair, semen, and blood did not belong to any of them. This was rather odd, given the fact that the suspects were found in possession of Fawn's belongings. Detectives speculated that the 3 guys had indeed robbed her house that night, but there was another man with them. He was the one who had abused and killed the girl. All of this raised even more questions. Could it be that 4 criminals entered the house unnoticed, killed Fawn, and just as unnoticed, left the scene of the crime? The police still had no answer to this question. Since then, the case has once again stalled. With each passing year, the Fawn family believed less and less that the murder would ever be solved. They continued to believe that those 3 suspects had been in their house that night and could point to the killer, but would never do so. The only thing that could help them learn the truth was a DNA sample stored in the police lab. In 2018, something interesting happened. Amber, Fawn's younger sister, revealed some disturbing details about the crime. She put her thoughts and facts unknown to the police on a popular American forum for unsolved crimes. Over the 20 years of its existence, the forum had gained a very reliable reputation, and its participants have helped the police solve several high-profile cases. Amber has been verified and confirmed that she really is who she says she is, so her post is worthy of attention. She herself worked as a nanny from Monday to Friday and was only at home during the day. On weekends, the girl slept in the very room on the second floor through which the burglars had snuck in. Accordingly, the criminals would have been immediately spotted. In addition, they would have watched the house and waited until Fawn's mother and her younger sister went to pick up the girl from work. Despite all this, Amber's story didn't bring the case any closer to solving it. But it was already 2018, and the science of DNA research had come a long way. Dozens, if not hundreds, of long-forgotten cases were being solved thanks to new analysis tools. Fawn's relatives saw it all and resented why the police were in no hurry to reopen the murder investigation. They kept talking to detectives about the case, and each time they got the same answer. Extended DNA testing requires money, and the police have dozens of cases. For that reason, the relatives were left to wait for their turn and funding to come in. But they decided to take the initiative and launched a fundraiser in 2019. The family wanted to cover the full cost of the DNA samples and also offered a $10,000 reward for any information that would lead to the perpetrator's capture. Due to the extensive media coverage of the case and numerous interviews given by the family, many people who cared responded to requests for help. The family quickly collected the necessary amount of money, but even here they were disappointed. The police department refused to initiate this investigation at the expense of the relatives of the victim. The lead detective explained that there was bound to be a big problem in such a situation. If the relatives of one victim could pay for such tests and expedite the results, then hundreds of other families who have been searching for years for the murder of their loved ones should have the same right. But it is simply impossible to implement such a thing in practice, since only a few laboratories in the world conduct innovative DNA tests. And with such a simultaneous influx of those wishing to do so, their resources are simply not enough. The leading company in this field is Parabon Nanolabs, which we have already repeatedly mentioned in the other reels. They have made tremendous progress in the study of DNA, from finding a person's relatives from the smallest genetic samples to creating an approximate portrait of the owner of the DNA. It was this lab that was to take over the study of the samples left in Fawn's bedroom the night she was murdered. The girl's relatives believed that the police were in no hurry to pursue their case for another reason. They were a poor family from a bad neighborhood, and murder was not a priority for investigators there. In an interview, Sister Fawn said that if it had been a murder of a family of rich or high-ranking people, all the necessary investigations would have been done instantly. Unfortunately, they never managed to expedite the process, and it wasn't until late 2020 that the long-awaited breakthrough happened. But the family wasn't ready for that kind of truth. With funding from the FBI, the police did send samples from Fawn's room to a lab. There, they began a detailed examination of the DNA and a search for a possible relative of its possessors. It was the semen sample found at the murder scene that they mostly worked with. In November 2020, they were finally able to find the person to whom that DNA belonged. It turned out to be Fawn's cousin, Donald Cox. Of course, such news shocked the whole family. At the time of Fawn's death, Donald was 21 years old, and no one had even considered his possible involvement. That said, Donald was a pretty troubled man and was constantly behind bars. He was tried for misdemeanors such as theft and possession of illegal substances. Unfortunately, in those years, they did not yet take a DNA sample from such criminals. Otherwise, this case would have been solved much earlier. Donald died of an overdose in 2006, but the police investigated his death because certain circumstances seemed suspicious to them. It was because of that investigation that a sample of his DNA was preserved, but it was not entered into the FBI database because the man in that case was a victim, not a perpetrator. Once the experts informed the police of their discovery, they matched the sample with the semen found at the murder scene and got a 100% match. Despite the gravity of this discovery, the relatives have received an answer to a question that has plagued them for 31 years. But there remained one very important point in the whole story. A great deal of evidence indicated that the three original suspects had also been in the Fawn house that night. It was now becoming clear how the perpetrators knew the house and the family's routines so precisely. Donald was a frequent visitor and knew all these nuances. However, the police closed the case and no new charges were filed against the three men. Sister Fawn said she saw no point in trying to get a confession out of them. Even though the men had been present in the house that night, they may not have even witnessed the murder itself. Donald may well have stayed in the house alone and only then attacked Fawn. Felicia added that the three suspects had already paid for their act. Throughout this time, while the case remained unsolved, the entire neighborhood was 100% certain of their guilt. Because of this, they were treated very negatively, with all the consequences that would follow. According to Sister Fawn, their lives were effectively ruined. In addition, After the case was closed, it turned out that the police had originally learned about the suspects from the family of one of them. Relatives noticed a Nintendo set-top box among his belongings and remembered that this was the one that had been stolen from Fawn's house. It was on the news, and everyone in the neighborhood already knew the details. In any case, it is simply impossible to prove their guilt, and the relatives of the victim finally know the name of the killer. He lived for 17 years without any punishment for what he had done, and all that time, as if nothing had happened, communicated with his family, but eventually his addiction to illegal substances drove him to his grave, and he was no longer a threat to anyone. Inga Lotz grew up in an affluent and well-off family. Her parents, Jan and Juanita Lotz, were quite prosperous and respected individuals. Her father was a respected professor of radiology at the University of Stellenbosch, and her mother was a physiotherapist. Inga excelled in school, demonstrated talents in singing and playing the piano, and was known for her kindness and responsiveness. After completing high school, she enrolled in the University of Stellenbosch, where she successfully pursued a bachelor's degree in mathematics and later continued her studies in the master's program. Inga was one of the top students at the university, always in the spotlight. Her pleasant appearance, cheerful demeanor, and friendly nature attracted a following. In 2004, Inga began dating Fred van de Veyer, a 22-year-old fellow student who had already earned a bachelor's degree and was working at a well-known insurance company in Cape Town. Fred came from a wealthy farming family, was educated, and well-read. Despite dating for only about 6 months, Fred was seriously considering marriage and had met Inga's parents, introducing her to his own. In early March 2005, Inga moved into an apartment in a prestigious residential complex on the outskirts of Stellenbosch. Considering the city's high crime rate and frequent incidents of violence against women, Inga took precautions for her safety. Hence, she chose an apartment in this residential complex, meeting high security standards including high walls with electric fencing, remote-controlled gates, and surveillance cameras throughout the complex. Inga gradually settled into her new apartment, furnishing it and making minor repairs. On March 16, 2005, the police received a call reporting the discovery of the body of a young woman with signs of violent death in an apartment under surveillance. Police quickly arrived at the crime scene and found Inga Lotz lying on the couch. Upon initial examination of the body, investigators identified signs of a brutal assault on the young woman. Detectives discovered that the victim had a broken nose and had sustained multiple deep blows to the head, neck, and chest with a heavy object, presumably a baseball bat or hammer. The girl's left arm showed significant swelling, while her right arm had numerous bruises and deep cuts on the wrist, and her legs and lower abdomen were covered in bruises. Detectives suspected that the victim had clearly attempted to defend herself against the assailant. During the examination of the apartment, investigators found no signs of forced entry or robbery. Valuable items were in plain sight, and the victim's personal belongings, money, and phone were untouched. The only items missing were a kitchen knife and the remote control for the gate of the residential complex. On the investigators' coffee table, they found a DVD disc box with a single fingerprint, and in the bathroom, a single bloody shoe print, presumably from the perpetrator. Considering the nature of the injuries inflicted on the girl, investigators speculated that the motive for such a murder could be intense personal animosity. Detectives found it peculiar that there were almost no bloodstains in the apartment, only a small puddle near the victim's head and a few drops on the floor. However, the character of the injuries suggested that there should have been more bloodstains in the apartment. Investigators also noted the almost perfect order around, which seems strange given the bruises on the girl's body, indicating that she likely resisted the attacker. Taking all these circumstances into account, the investigating officer hypothesized that the girl's murder likely occurred elsewhere, and her body was later moved to the apartment. According to the forensic examination, the girl had suffered a severe blow to the head with a heavy object, possibly a hammer, followed by numerous knife wounds to the neck, arms, legs, and abdomen, totaling more than 40 stabbed wounds, as determined by experts. A few hours after the discovery of Inga Lotz's body, the news of her death made headlines across the country. The photograph of the beautiful, smiling girl appeared on the front pages of newspapers nationwide. Relatives and close friends of the girl were shocked and devastated by this tragic news, and everyone was puzzled about the motive behind the attack and the identity of her killer. Police continued their investigation on hot leads and learned that the girl's body was discovered by a young man named Christo Pretorius, a mutual friend of Inga and Fred, who lived adjacent to the girl. Christo Pretorius explained that on the evening of March 16th at 10:30 p.m., he went to Inga Lotz's apartment at the request of her boyfriend, Fred van der Vijver. Fred had been unable to reach her for quite some time during the day, and considering that Christo lived in the adjacent building, he was the quickest to check if everything was okay with the girl. Upon reaching Inga's apartment door, Christo rang the intercom several times, but received no response. He then started knocking on the door, but still no one answered. Christo listened closely and thought he heard the sound of a television inside. Turning the doorknob, he found the door unlocked. The apartment was dark, but the living room was visible in the light from the working television. Christo spotted the figure of a woman lying motionless on the couch, and upon closer inspection, recognized her as Inga, her head and face covered in blood. The young man immediately called the police and informed Fred about the incident, who became the next person interrogated by the investigators. Fred shared that he had been trying to reach his girlfriend, Inga Lotz, all day and grew seriously concerned when she stopped answering his calls. Worried, Fred called Inga's mother, who mentioned having talked to her daughter around noon and assumed that Inga might have turned off her phone to focus on preparing for an upcoming university exam. Despite this, Fred persisted in trying to reach Inga and around 10 p.m. decided to go to her home to make sure everything was okay. However, as he needed to first visit Inga's mother to obtain spare keys to her apartment, and this would take some time, he asked their mutual friend Christo Pretorius, who lived next door to Inga, to check on her. It was from Christo that Fred learned about the tragic death of his girlfriend. Interviewing Inga's friends and family and examining surveillance cameras at the nearest store, the police established the timeline of that day. In the morning before her university lectures, Inga briefly met with Fred. After classes, she had lunch with childhood friend Vimpai Boshoff, who incidentally was the last friend to see her alive. Returning home at 13:15, she allowed workers, who were doing minor repairs in her apartment, to enter. By the time they finished their work, she was on the phone with her mother, who mentioned hearing Inga escorting the workers to the door and locking it. At 13:36, Inga sent Fred a final SMS message. Later, Inga was captured on surveillance cameras at a store where at 14:55, she purchased a hamburger at a restaurant, picked up a DVD from a local rental, and bought a magazine before returning home. From that point, her phone went silent. Continuing the investigation, detectives learned that on the day of the murder, there was a power outage in the residential complex and at the gates, which were guarded entrances, for several hours. This was due to the work of electricians installing a fan in the trash chute room and construction workers laying tiles and repairing balcony doors. As a result, the home was left without security and surveillance for a few hours. At this stage, the investigators' suspicion centered on Inga's closest circle of friends and acquaintances. Among those who came under suspicion were childhood friend Vimpai Boshoff, former boyfriend Brown Kruger, friend and neighbor Fred Marius Botha, and, of course, Fred van der Vyver himself. Both Wim Pie Boshoff and ex-boyfriend Brown Kruger had alibis supported by witnesses and were excluded from the list of suspects. Later investigations revealed that Fred had a solid alibi. He was in his office throughout the day, confirmed by eyewitness testimony. Surveillance camera footage showed him entering the building at 11 o'clock and leaving at 1800 hours. He was not seen on camera at any other time. Despite this, detectives continued to suspect him, convinced that the perpetrator was someone Inga knew well, and the press and police believed that Fred, being a jealous and controlling boyfriend, fit this profile perfectly. Journalists uncovered some details about the couple's relationship that gave the police grounds to seriously suspect Fred van der Vyver. Despite the outwardly prosperous appearance of Fred and Inga's relationship, it was far from ideal, with serious disputes and arguments arising between them recently. According to Inga's friend Wim Pie Boshoff, during that lunch, Inga admitted that her relationship with Fred was on the verge of breaking up. She revealed that they had a serious disagreement that morning, and she wasn't sure if things would improve after that. Inga mentioned that she wanted to get engaged to Fred by the end of the year, but her father expressed concerns. From the beginning of their relationship, he noticed that Fred manipulated and controlled every move Inga made. The girl's mother also shared her husband's concerns. In their last meeting, she noticed bruises on her daughter's arms, which Inga attributed to gym workouts but wore a long-sleeved sweater despite the warm weather. The mother also witnessed a phone argument between Inga and Fred, during which Inga asked him not to come anymore and leave her alone. However, over the weekend, contrary to her daughter's wishes, Fred still visited. According to the mother, the boyfriend closely monitored the girl, telling her how to behave, what to wear, and with whom to associate. During the funeral arrangements, disagreements arose between the girl's parents and Fred, as he took charge of everything without consulting them. After a few days, when Fred was found rummaging through Inga's belongings in the closet, the girl's father asked him to leave their home and never come back. During the forensic examination of the sole fingerprint found on the DVD box, it was determined to belong to Fred. Consequently, the inference was drawn that Fred was in Inga's apartment after 1500 hours, presumably at the time of her murder, as the disc was rented by the girl at 1455. During the search at Fred's house, investigators found the young man's athletic shoes, and the footprint from them matched the bloody trace discovered in Inga's bathroom. Focusing on the search for the murder weapon, the police found that Fred owned a decorative hammer given to him by Inga's parents as a Christmas present, serving as a bottle opener. It was kept under the front seat of Fred's car and had never been used. Combining all the evidence and analyzing Fred's movements on the day of Inga's death, the police found inconsistencies. At that time, it was known that Fred arrived at the company where he worked around 11 a.m. and attended a meeting with colleagues at 1310. From that time until 1515, Fred did not use either his computer or his phone. Investigators speculated that he could have left his workplace through the company's parking lot between 1530 and 1715, remaining unnoticed by surveillance cameras. 3 months after the girl's murder, rumors circulated in the media that the police were about to arrest Fred. His lawyer advised him to surrender voluntarily, and Fred complied. The young man agreed to undergo a polygraph test to prove his innocence and successfully passed it. However, considering the substantial amount of evidence against him, Fred was formally charged, leading to his arrest. After a 2-year investigation, in early 2007, the trial of Fred van der Vyver began and lasted for 9 months, making it one of the most prominent and controversial cases in South Africa's history. Fred's family sold their farm to hire and finance his defense. The key piece of evidence in this case was the fingerprint,
and Fred's family enlisted an American fingerprint expert who made a sensational statement. He claimed that the fingerprint supposedly found on the DVD box was actually lifted from a cylindrical surface, such as a glass, and not from a flat surface like a box. This fingerprint underwent re-examination, and forensic experts determined that it was indeed lifted from a glass, while the one taken from the DVD box was apparently lost or mixed up with other prints. As the prosecution presumed, this fingerprint on the DVD box was considered to be the murderer's print, and the case against Fred was essentially built on it. However, mysteriously, this crucial fingerprint disappeared. This was just one of many investigative errors that would be exposed during the trial. The defense pointed out that 5 police officers, during the crime scene inspection, freely roamed around the apartment, confusing and destroying evidence. The defense also argued that Fred could not have left his workplace, committed such a heinous crime, returned, and managed to clean up within such a short time frame. Colleagues who saw Fred at work on that day described his behavior as calm and well-balanced. Additionally, the defense's expert provided evidence that the bloodstain from the shoe in the bathroom did not match Fred's footwear and might not be a footprint at all. Regarding the murder weapon, the decorative hammer, no blood or DNA traces were found on it. Upon re-examination, it was determined that it did not correspond to the size of the wounds inflicted on the victim. Consequently, the case against Fred van der Vyver fell apart in court, and in November 2007, he was acquitted. After that, the investigation into the case came to a halt, but the grief-stricken parents of Inget continued to fight for justice, insisting on a reassessment of the evidence and the reopening of the case. They did not want the memory of their daughter to be forgotten, organizing rallies, distributing pamphlets, and even hiring private detectives. In March 2012, when Inga's parents offered a reward of 1 million rand, about $80,000, for information that could lead to solving her murder, renewed interest in finding those responsible for the young girl's death emerged. Media reports indicated that during the investigation, detectives obtained information that Inga had received anonymous threatening phone calls for several weeks leading up to her murder. The calls were traced to a public telephone booth near her residential complex, but no clear suspects were identified in the surveillance camera footage. The content of the calls was not disclosed to the public, leading many to speculate and guess about potential motives for the girl's murder. At the same time, investigators explored the theory of the involvement of one of Inga's classmates in her murder. It was discovered that shortly before the murder, the girl had a serious quarrel with a fellow student over a research project. The dispute was so intense that Inga filed a complaint with the university's disciplinary council against this student. Although she was questioned by the police, no direct evidence linking this incident to the murder was established, and the suspicions against the girl were lifted. To this day, nearly 2 decades after the murder of Inga Lotz, the case remains unsolved. The circumstances of her death, bearers in the police investigation, the sometimes appearing, mysteriously disappearing evidence, the contradictory legal proceedings, and unanswered questions have made this case one of the most perplexing in South Africa. Over the years, several books have even been released based on this story. However, for the girl's family, the pain of losing their only child and the thought that the killer has not been justly punished have not diminished for a moment.
Riley Goodrich was born and raised in the American city of Corona, California. In school, she played volleyball and was a cheerleader, as well as had many friends. They described her as a positive, open, and fun-loving young woman with a big heart. After graduating from high school, Riley received a scholarship to Grand Canyon University in Arizona. She moved to a dormitory but tried to visit her family whenever possible. In the summer of 2021, she finished her first year and returned to Corona for the holidays. On July 4th, on Independence Day, her friends threw a big party, There, Riley met a young man named Anthony Baraha, who was a year older than her. They quickly developed a liking for each other and continued to communicate in the following days. Anthony unexpectedly became a popular figure on TikTok. In 2019, he created an account where he posted various humorous videos. At some point, his videos began to attract the attention of a wide audience, and by the summer of 2021, he had almost 1 million subscribers. The guy also actively developed his account on Instagram, but was still trying to figure out what to do in the future. Continue to run his blog as his main activity, or do something else. After chatting for some time on social media, they decided to go on a first date, but it was important for Riley that her father Dave approved of her choice. Despite the fact that she was already 18 years old at that time, the young woman was very close to her parents and wanted them to meet Anthony first. At first, the young woman's father was skeptical, mostly because Anthony made a living through TikTok. It all seemed not very serious to him. However, when they met in person, Anthony made a good impression on Dave, and the father approved of his daughter's choice. The guy seemed to him kind, well-mannered, and overall a positive person. In the end, Riley and Anthony decided to meet on July 26 and go to an evening movie session, choosing the movie The Forever Purge. The plot of the film is based on the fact that in the United States, every year they legalize any crime for 12 hours, including murder. Who would have thought how creepy of a coincidence it would be to choose this movie? Before heading to the cinema, they had dinner at their favorite restaurant, Riley located nearby. Their screening started at 9:30 p.m. and ended closer to midnight. Considering it was a weekday, there were not many people in the theater. During the movie, Riley messaged her mother that the film seemed boring to her, but she still enjoyed the date with Anthony. The young woman did not contact her mother anymore after that. When the movie ended, a theater employee went into the hall to clean up the room. To his surprise, he found Riley and Anthony there. From a distance, it seemed to him that the couple was just sitting or sleeping in their seats. But as soon as he took a few steps towards them, he was horrified to discover that both visitors were seriously wounded and unconscious. After calling 911, the police and ambulance arrived at the scene. The medics almost immediately determined that Riley had already passed away. Anthony was still alive, but in a serious unconscious condition. He was taken to the local hospital and connected to life support equipment, while detectives began investigating the crime scene. At first, it was difficult for them to understand what had happened in the theater. The only thing they managed to establish almost immediately was the fact that Riley and Anthony were shot in the head. However, there were no clues at the crime scene that could shed light on what had happened. Of course, it was absolutely useless for detectives to take fingerprints or search for DNA samples in the cinema, so they went a different way. Almost immediately, the story spread through California media and later throughout the country. In the first hours of the investigation, there was even a theory that Anthony could have been the killer, allegedly shooting Riley and then taking his own life. But the police did not even consider this version, if only because, in that case, the weapon would have been lying nearby and it was nowhere to be found. As soon as the detectives identified the victims' identities, they contacted their families and informed them of what had happened. Riley's parents simply could not believe that their daughter was dead. Just a few minutes before her death, she was texting with her mother, and no one could have thought that something so tragic could happen during a movie screening. In addition, the police could not provide any details to her relatives about what had happened, as they themselves still had no idea what had happened in that theater. As for Anthony, the doctor's prognosis was bleak. The young man had suffered a serious injury, and the medical staff had to do everything possible to help him. First, the detectives questioned the theater employees who worked that evening. It turned out that only 6 tickets were sold for the showing. This meant that the killer was most likely one of the 4 visitors. There was another aspect that puzzled not only the police, but also everyone who learned about this incident from the news. If the killer was one of the 6 viewers, How did the other two visitors not hear the sounds of gunfire? The only explanation at that time was the version that the other two viewers simply took the sounds of gunfire as part of the movie. This action movie had many violent scenes, including the use of weapons. The theory that the killer struck during one of these scenes was not excluded. However, this mystery was quickly solved. Detectives found that out of all the tickets sold, 4 were purchased by one person for himself and 3 of his friends. This led the police to think that the crime could have been committed by a group of people. The investigation continued all night, and the next day, the police announced the arrest of the suspect. He turned out to be 20-year-old Joseph Jimenez. The interesting fact here is that pure chance helped to catch the suspect. It turned out that Joseph himself called the police the next day after the murder, but he did not do this to confess to the crime. At around 9:30 p.m., Joseph called 911 and reported that someone was chasing him. When the police arrived, they found him in the middle of the street with a gun in his hand and arrested him. They immediately realized that the attack in the theater was carried out using a weapon of the same caliber, so they handed Joseph's gun over to the experts. Having 3 empty shells from the theater in their hands, they established that this was the same weapon. Jimenez denied his involvement in the murder, but the detectives quickly found another weighty evidence. Searching the suspect's house, they found Riley Goodrich's wallet there. Later, the police located the other 3 individuals who were at the movie theater with Joseph. It turned out that they were all friends with him, but their story truly shocked the detectives. According to them, none of them had any idea that a simple trip to the movies would turn into such a tragedy. They were just sitting and watching the film, but during the screening they began to notice something strange. Joseph suddenly began to behave very suspiciously. He was talking to himself and muttering something unintelligible. At some point he said that he needed to go to the bathroom and left. However, instead of going to the bathroom, he went to his car, took out a gun, and returned. After sitting for some time, he suddenly told his friends that he had brought a gun from his car, and they began to panic. In the end, the friends allegedly lied to him, saying that they also needed to use the bathroom and would return. But instead, they left and went outside. There were many strange moments in their story that could be doubted. The most concerning part was their escape from the theater. Did they really not try to find out why Joseph brought a gun, and did they not consider that he might use it against the 2 other moviegoers? Moreover, the friends did not report any of this to theater staff or the police. Joseph's behavior, practically indisputable, indicated that he was planning to do something bad. But his friends decided to simply ignore the entire situation, and they admitted that as soon as they heard about the murder, they immediately thought of Joseph. All of this was enough to arrest Jimenez on 3 charges: murder, attempted murder, and robbery. At that time, Anthony was still on life support, but in the end, the doctors could not help him. On the evening of July 31st, he passed away without regaining consciousness. In connection with this, Joseph was charged with an additional count of murder, which carried the possibility of a death sentence. While detectives tried to get any information from him, hundreds of concerned people held a farewell ceremony in memory of Riley and Anthony outside the movie theater. They lit candles and expressed words of support to the families of the victims. It was then that it became known that long before the incident, Anthony had signed papers allowing his organs to be donated to those in need in the event of his death. The young man could hardly have imagined that it would happen so soon. The situation was not looking good for Joseph Jimenez. With the evidence against him, he was almost guaranteed to end up on death row. Apparently, he understood this perfectly and decided to confess to the crime. However, his story raised even more questions. Joseph claimed that he was diagnosed with schizophrenia 9 months ago, which he had been managing with medication. Shortly before the incident, he stopped taking his medication and voices started to appear in his head.
At first, they told him that someone was going to steal his car and TV, but later they threatened to kill his entire family. On the night at the cinema, he heard the voices again, and this time they ordered him to kill Riley and Anthony. They also promised to kill his entire family if he refused. According to Jimenez, he tried to resist these voices, but in the end he gave in and committed the crime. In his speech, he devoted a lot of attention to how scared he was during the murder and in the following hours, as well as how he worried about his future. Of course, this turn in the case was perceived ambiguously. Let's look at the facts and try to understand if we can trust him. Could Joseph have made up this whole story about the voices? Of course. Moreover, only serious mental problems could have saved him from the death penalty in this case, so it was his only chance to avoid such a sentence. In addition, the petty theft of Riley's wallet does not fit into his story, according to which Joseph was so frightened that he immediately ran out of the cinema and got into his car after the shots. Who, in a panic, is going to steal a wallet? On the other hand, there are still many strange moments in his actions. If we believe his friends, he talked to himself and behaved suspiciously. In addition, Joseph himself called the police, saying that someone was chasing him, but in reality, he was just standing in the middle of the street with a gun. If we assume that all of this was a planned game, the plan to avoid responsibility seems too complicated. But if we still consider such an option, the situation could have developed in a completely different way. During the movie, Joseph realized that there were only two random people in the theater who he could rob. He went to his car to get a weapon, but something went wrong, or perhaps he truly intended to commit murder. It's possible his friends were even present at the time and didn't leave the theater. However, it's unclear why he didn't take the victim's smartphones if that was his motive, and why did he call the police the next day instead of hoping not to be caught. Additionally, Joseph had no criminal history and had never been in trouble even for minor offenses. It's hard to imagine someone without a criminal past suddenly committing double murder over a wallet, especially with such a high likelihood of being caught. In late September, the first court hearing took place, during which Joseph pleaded not guilty, citing his mental state. This doesn't mean he denies involvement in the murders, but now the court needed to consider the issue of his sanity. Jimenez stated that he would only plead guilty if deemed insane. The next court hearing was scheduled for the first half of 2022. A decision about the defendant's mental state has not yet been made, as he still needs to undergo evaluation. In any case, whatever the outcome of this case, it is shocking in its injustice. The two innocent young men simply wanted to spend an evening at the movies and ended up as victims of a completely random act of aggression. The public and media blamed the theater management for not checking Joseph upon entering the theater. But should they be blamed? In the United States, theater staff only check backpacks and bags to prevent visitors from bringing in outside food. But if someone brings a gun and hides it under their clothes, no one will ever know. The only thing that can be done in such a situation is to install metal detectors in every theater. Perhaps this will become a mandatory requirement over time. What do you think? Was Joseph truly mentally ill and that led to his horrific act? Or was the story about the voices fabricated to avoid a death sentence?